Very good. So we'll go ahead and get started. Just give me one short second. There we go. So let me know if you can't see the screen. What we're going to go through today is kind of one of 5 virtual courses we offer every single year for all the companies that's a part of or basically subscribe to Whitson Plus. We will focus today on the RTA piece of the software. The other courses this year we have had one on PVT. We had one on bottom wall pressures. There's another one on flow material balance, and later one other one on nodal later in the year. So an intention here, probably different to for those of you who've done a lot of these kind of in-person courses this year, which are a little bit more how to click the buttons in the software and kind of a more holistic workflow when it comes to, we touch a little bit about, on every single part of the tool. But today we're going to only focus on the RTA pieces. Before we get going with kind of the main topics, we'll go ahead and do a quick introduction. First and foremost, the course is recorded. And when it comes to the software access, all of you should have gotten a user when it comes to Whitson Plus. So just go to courses.whitson.com. Your username should be your email, and the password is Whitson RTA 2023 and a star at the end. And if you have any issues with that, my colleague Teja, he is monitoring support, so just send an email to support@whitson.com and we'll make sure that to help you to log in there. But in a nutshell, it should just be nothing.
Matthias?
Yeah.
Will this recording be available later on the top website?
On the top website, what do you mean? The recording will be available, so we'll distribute the recording after the call.
Okay, thanks.
Perfect. And that goes for the afternoon session as well. So all of these courses are recorded, and I'll show you how to access them later as well. If you, of course, you can send me an email, and I'll always send it your way. But in a nutshell, to access the software, again, for this course, you're not going to use your own company domain. So all the people in the course has access to the software through their company domain. But just go to courses.whitson.com, and that's where we're going to do some of the pieces today. Okay, and we're going to actually do the work in this project called RTA course here up to the left. Okie doke. And again, so just not use your company domain, use courses domain right there. And we're going to go through a few wells today in terms of and a few kind of special things, if you like. If you've kind of gone through that workflow before, maybe the most important thing for you today is to learn some of the new things and some of the details of the RTA part that we haven't been able to, that we typically don't go through in the courses that we teach in person. So really quick, tomorrow is the knowledge sharing session for the Numerical RTA Consortium. That's the second one. It's a 3-hour kind of virtual meeting with 9 different presentations on different topics. So that's the second of in total 3 consortiums or knowledge sharing sessions. The course today is the third, as I mentioned, of a few small courses we run throughout the year. So all of them are half-day courses like this, and they try to blend software and theory. So we try to focus much more on the theory part and then how that can be applied in the software. And then instead of just how to click the button. So we try to keep that to a good mix. Today we're here at the green one with analytical and numerical RTA, so 28th of June. If some of you need for like their PE certificates and stuff, if you guys need a certificate to just prove that you've been in this training, just let me know and I'll send that to you after the course. And what we're going to cover today is some basics related to the software. And it's also, else than that, a pure RTA focus. So we're going to focus only on the RTA pieces and assume that all the inputs to the RTA work is kind of given to us, that we know them. So the PVT, the bottom wall pressure, etc. We'll assume that they are correct, even though in most cases in reality there will be some uncertainty there as well. So we'll try to be back to basics and there's a lot of things we'll not cover. So that's in-depth details of all the other things that goes into a workflow, integrations, PVT acreage map, separator optimization, gas EOR, shrinkage calculations, you name it. There's a ton of other things you can do. We'll not touch upon this today. Pure focus on RTA. We'll try to keep it practical. So the things we learn, we'll try to show you how you can do that in the software. And we also believe in repetition. So that's, I know a few of you guys have been probably even having this course last year. So it's an updated course content, but it's also, if you've had these in-person courses, there's a few key things that probably might be clearer the second time you hear it and after you worked a little bit with the tools and everything. So a few of the things will be repeated on purpose, and then a few of the things we'll probably repeat 3-4 times, honestly, to make sure that it sticks. If you have any questions, just feel free to intervene or just ask a question in the chat box to the right, and I'll try to monitor that as we go. So again, we will talk about rate transient analysis today, and if some of you wanted to write a book about RTA, or if you asked your teacher in school what is RTA, or if you asked anybody in the industry really that tries to teach RTA in a nutshell, the textbook definition of RTA would probably be something like this. So rate transient analysis is a type of form of analysis in the oil and gas domain where you use both fluid rates and flowing pressures at the same time. So compared to DCA, the only difference, the major difference is DCA only uses the fluid rates, and RTA uses the flowing pressures as well. For the longest time, if we were engineers sitting in this room 30 years ago, most likely we would not have been here in a course on RTA. We would most likely be here for a course on well testing, or what's called PTA, or pressure transient analysis. And that was type of tests that were done on wells where you typically would go in and shut in a well. So the rate is essentially constant. The rate is 0, and then you analyze the flowing pressures and the reservoir signals to do different types of work. RTA is kind of it's exact same equations as PTA, but we like to say that we flip those equations upside down. But fundamentally, it's similar problems that you try to address. So a lot of the concepts that we're using in RTA, we've kind of stolen from PTA. Before we're going to, dig into what or how we actually do RTA, or what goes into RTA in a nutshell, I think it's very important to emphasize what RTA is used for in general. And this is going back to when I was in university. I remember I learned about a lot of stuff, and then I guess I was so naive that I thought everything was something that I was going to get used for when I started to work. And then I kind of forgot about, what are the objectives of what we're going to learn? Why is it important for me, or for you guys as engineers, or for the companies that you guys work in, to know something about RTA? So just to touch upon kind of the textbook definition of what RTA typically is used for, it is one of these items right here. And first and foremost, you use it to quantify some kind of productivity. And there's 2 different ways to quantify productivity that is an output from RTA. We'll talk much more about that later, but for now, let's just assume that we use it to quantify productivity, and that's it. And this productivity quantification, physical if you like, is used for well performance comparison. For forecasting exercises, we have basically a physically bound forecast. Use it for completion effectiveness and fract optimization. Once you have call it a simplified RTA model, you can use it for production optimization and drawdown management. And it's also very, very frequently used for calibration / starting points for more advanced simulation studies. And there's, of course, a much longer list here, but this is some of the more important points, and we see it also feeds into all kinds of machine learning or multivariate analysis type of work as well. So it depends on what you would like to do with it, but in general, it feeds as an input to a wide range of workflows and objectives, and this is probably some of the most common ones. The way I like to, and I focus a lot on this in the courses we teach in general when it comes to kind of the buckets of RTA, because I remember when I started to try to learn a little bit about RTA, which is actually not that long ago, probably, I think COVID was kind of when I started to dig into a lot of RTA topics. And I remember back in the beginning when we started that journey, that a lot of people I talked to, they'd said, yeah, I've tried RTA and it doesn't work. Or it didn't work for me. And I was always curious. Like in the beginning, I didn't know even what questions to ask. So I was always really curious on what do they actually mean. And then as we've done more and more of this work and had these consortiums and teaching these classes and stuff, I figured out actually what part of RTA that they're saying that they typically have burnt themselves on. So we'll go through that. But just to hopefully structure your head a little bit, because it definitely helped in my head. I'll just go through a few different categories of where, at least when people say they do RTA, what they're actually doing right here. Okay, and the first thing they do is that they use flowing rates and pressures together for flow regime identification. Okay, or for just pure diagnostics. Nothing else. They are literally just looking at a plot of rate normalized pressure and pressure normalized rates. If you don't know what that is yet, we'll define that later. So that's totally fine. And that's it. Those plots can be created in a second or less. So it's very, very fast. What will probably take the most time there is to gather the pressure data and probably potentially, if you don't have gauge data, calculate the bottom hole pressures. Okay. The second thing is if you have done that diagnostic work on one well, you can then start to make a wide range of these type of plots, either if it's rate normalized pressure or pressure normalized rate. So basically rates that are accounting for this change in or differences in pressure over time, and you can plot them on the same plot. And that's the second bucket of RTA. So basically relative well performance where you have normalized for the difference in pressure drawdown. So when you look at two different call it DCA curves or rate curves versus time, I know that always it will not be a fair comparison, because probably never has two wells have the identical drawdown strategy. They might be similar, but they're very seldom identical, and in many times they're really, really different because opinions on flowback strategy changes over time. Maybe pricing environments are what changes your flowback strategy. Maybe the oil and gas price is so high that just because of time, value, and money, that you don't want to risk it, so you open the chokes up fully, even though you know that that might damage your well. Okay, so over time, especially if you compare wells, even on the same pad, they might have really, really different pressure drawdown profiles because of different reasons. And to normalize out that difference, to have a fair apple-to-apple comparison between the wells, you can lay them on the same plot. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. Maybe I'll show how that's done. Okay, so that's the second bucket. And again, this is stuff that takes seconds. It's not like stuff, if you have the data, it takes seconds. So it's not really, and it's also something that's, you can't say RTA doesn't work kind of thing for this, because it's, it's just relative differences of wells plotted on the same plot, and it gives you information on what well is more productive versus less productive. So that's very simple, but it's still kind of in the realm of RTA. Then we have when I talk about RTA, if I talk to any of you guys, let's go ahead and do RTA on a well. What I'm actually saying is, let's go to this well right here, and let's try to quantify an A root K and a contacted pore volume. That's two parameters that you can quote unquote uniquely get from an RTA workflow. If you've never heard about these terms before, we're going to define them later. But for now, these are two, call it bulk parameters that we can quantify from a well. And when I say that let's go and try to do some RTA on a well, what I'm actually saying is let's try to quantify these two guys such that we can build a numerical model that we can use for a wide range of exercises. Okay, so I think everybody is and this is also a thing that's is fairly doable to do. And once you have those two parameters, you can actually tie that to a physically based forecast. Okay, so you can use those, and no matter how you mix and match those parameters up, as long as the bulk parameters are the same, the forecast and history match is the same. So we'll talk more about that later. And the last bucket of RTA, that's where I've seen people burn themselves so many times, and it's still an topic that is where I see there's still a lot of work going on in a lot of the operators' shops, and using RTA for well spacing exercises. That's what really bucket 4 is. And the problem you get into is once you've done RTA, you can quantify a quote-unquote unique A root K, and you can quantify a contacted pore volume. Those parameters, at least for ideal scenarios, without noise and all that stuff, they will be unique parameters. The problem is if you want to decouple those or try to use those two parameters to resolve a fracture half length and a permeability of your system, you have already made a lot of assumptions. And my experience at least is that sometimes when people do these well spacing decisions or using RTA for well spacing, they're actually not aware of all the assumptions that they're making going from number 3 to number 4. The first assumptions that you're making is that you're essentially in full boundary dominated flow, at least if you use any of the classical techniques. The second thing that you're assuming is that you know what the number of fractures is and what the height of those fractures are. And the third thing is that you're basically saying that you know what the fracture shape is. You're saying that it's rectangular, a perfect rectangle, but in reality we know it's non-uniform. Okay, and I think Oxy had a really nice paper about this. So I'm just going to show that real quick now if people can see my screen. Yeah, I think this is a good, so Oxy did some work on this. So this is basically the type of geometry we resolve in RTA. Well, in reality, we're dealing with something that looks much more like this, like a teardrop shape. And this is from some other microseismic and stuff. And I think other types of diagnostics are indicating the same thing. And so all of those assumptions, and not accounting for that fractures are unevenly long, there's different height on them, probably there's not the 100% cluster efficiency, etc. All of those assumptions that we're making going from number 3 to number 4 can make it a little bit dangerous. At least you need to be aware of the assumptions that you're making there. So anyways, to sum up, so these are kind of the 4 buckets of RTA. So hopefully that helped you a little bit to quantify or separate between the different categories. And we're going to do all of this today. So just sit down and relax, and we'll get to that. But the first ones, they're really quick, and they can be done in seconds. And then at least if you want to do it with like a full numerical workflow, etc., when you get good at it, maybe 5 to 10 minutes per well for number 3 and number 4, if you have all the data and stuff there. Okay, so that tells a little bit about the relative differences in time. And RTA in a nutshell goes all the way back to this point right here. It's better to be roughly right than precisely wrong. So we in an RTA model, you can develop full numerical model with with PBT from equations of state, rigorous bottom wall pressure calculations, full physics numerical, like you would run it in CMG, Eclipse, Sensor, T-Navigator, whatever. You can do in 5 to 10 minutes. And for people like us in our shop, that is always also involved in huge simulations models that typically a full study maybe takes a full year to do. That there's a big contrast there. And one thing I've kind of learned the painful and hard way is, like, in the beginning when I started in the industry, I always thought a more complicated model, incorporating more complexity, incorporating more stuff into the model makes the model more right. And kind of over time convinced myself that it's probably the other way around. And it also goes back to the fact that if all of us are working on the same well together, and we would like to discuss it, it's really tricky to discuss a super advanced model, but it's very easy to discuss some of the models that we'll discuss today. Like if you take a well, like just take this one for example. Let's say this is a BHP calculation, and what we would like to talk about the inputs to that calculation. I can just copy this thing and send it to a colleague, and we can have a good conversation about that. The same goes for the numerical model. We can look at the assumptions for the inputs and stuff, as long as it's fairly digestible. So there was a question about the paper in the chat, to drop it in the chat. So I'll drop that for my good friend David there. So you have that. Awesome. When it comes to RTA, and what we at least kind of advocate for in our shop in general is what we call the unconventional reservoir workflow. So we get PVT from equations of state. We do bottom wall pressure calculations and multi-phase flow material balance, or dry gas material balance if you're in a dry gas area. And none of these things we'll actually talk about today. What we'll talk about today is what comes kind of after that, once you have PVT production data, bottom wall pressures, and maybe you've done some flow material balance to bracket your results, and that's the analytical and numerical RTA work. Okay, and it's also tying that to a simulation and forecasting exercise. So the whole course today is related to these two topics right here. And when I look at the people in the course today, it's probably a little bit more than I anticipated, honestly. But when I look at I see there's a really good mix of people who have done a lot of RTA in the past, and also some that has done not that much already. So for the newer people who have never done RTA before, I would like to just emphasize the two next slides are probably the only two slides that you'll need to know when it comes to RTA, at least to be a 95% RTA person. Just make sure that you remember the two next slides. And they're so important that for the people who have seen me present before, they're probably sick of seeing the slides, but that's how it is. But it's really fundamental. So the two next slides, the first one is related to flow regimes, and the second one is what you can derive from RTA, and that's it. So if you're new to RTA, pay attention to the next couple of slides. So the first thing is related to flow regimes, and flow regimes is really important because every time you, at least every time I look at the well, one of the first things I do is to get an idea of this first bucket. What flow regime are we in? And in the way we like to bucket flow regimes for Titan conventionals is essentially into three main categories. Infinite acting flow that ends as a pressure transit had reached one of the reservoir boundaries. And then the total other extreme of that is boundary dominated flow that starts when the wellbore pressure response is affected by all the reservoir boundaries. Okay, so that's two different extremes. The boundary dominated flow, that's what we learned about in school, typically called pseudo-steady state. Some people call it tank-like depletion. Most of the conventional reservoirs that we're dealing with, they're, always seeing boundary dominated flow. While in Titan conventionals, we have typically longer periods of infinite acting flow, and in between infinite acting flow and boundary dominated flow is what we call transitional flow. So we might have started to feel as this well, let's pretend we're the well, start to feel one of the boundaries, but not all of them. and we end up with this kind of compound mix of both of them. And that looks like typically like if you do the math of that, if you took models that was a mix of infinite acting flow and boundary dominated flow, you stack them together and just superpose them in an Excel or whatever, it looks like a power law relationship. And again, back to these cases where you see, for instance, B factors in tight unconventionals that are higher than 1 for a very, very long period of time, but they're not 2, for instance. So like if the B factor is 2 for constant bottom hole pressure, that means infinite acting linear flow. But if you have a number that's between essentially 2 and 1, and still is equal to or higher than 1, you by definition have to be in transitional flow in that period of time, else your reserves will be infinite. Okay, so that flow regime we'll talk much more about. Super important to have a relationship to, and it explains a lot of things that we typically are interfaced with on the reserve side as well. So that's the flow regimes. We need to have some buckets there, some ways to classify what the well's flow regime is in before we start to do the work. So this is kind of the first thing we do, first bucket, and once we've done that, we're kind of off to the races and we can quote unquote do RTA. Okay, so when I say do RTA, it's to quantify these two guys right here. And the first thing we can uniquely derive if we have pressure, rates, and PVT, that is your A root K. I call it A root K. Some people like to call it LFP, or the linear flow parameter. In this course, we try to use both just to be compliant, but it's the same thing, okay? Typically, we say that the LFP correlates with short-term CUMs, okay? So that's 3 months, 6 months, and 1 year CUMs, so short-term production. And then the other thing you can uniquely derive from RTA is the so-called contacted pore volume, or the contacted oil in place or gas in place. And this is what typically correlates with EUR. Okay, and why does it correlate with EUR? Because this number right here, multiplied with the recovery factor, is the definition of EUR. And we'll also spend a little bit of time emphasizing why we call it contacted in general, and why you'll see everywhere inside of the tool where we use, or at least in flow material balance or RTA exercises, it's on purpose put to be the word contacted in front of it. So you see here the word contacted oil in place, contacted gas in place, contacted pore volume. It's on purpose. It's on purpose. It's not the petrophysical amount. Okay, so these are the two things we can derive. That's the only two things we can get from a workflow, potentially. A root K, in a rigorous sense, we can only get that as while we're in infinite acting linear flow. And then the contacted pore volume is something we can only resolve when we're in full boundary dominated flow. So that means that if we're still infinite acting or transitional, we actually can't say with 100% certainty what our contacted pore volume is. Okay, so that then the contacted pore volume, or our EURs, that will be always a lower estimate of what our contacted pore volume, or what our potential EUR is, or what our contacted pore volume will be. Okay, if we're still in those flow regimes. So that's very important. Sometimes I hear a lot of people say that we have a great correlation between LFP and EUR, and that actually might be the case in some basins or for some areas. But actually, behind the scenes, what you truly have is you have a correlation between your LFP and your contacted oil in place or gas in place. Behind the scenes, you just haven't. I'm pretty sure in those cases, at least, they should plot on a straight line, and then you'll have also a great correlation to your EURs. So just note that that's something we see very, very often. Then I'm going to show one of my favorite slides that we've included, new slides that we included in the slide deck the last 6 months, and that comes from my good friend Sam. It's when he likes to communicate this to like a broader audience. Why do we do RTA, and what is the value of doing RTA, or getting or quantifying these two parameters? And he likes to put it into a picture of IP and EURs. So a high IP and a high EUR will give you both a high contacted pore volume and a high LFP. You can still have a high EUR and a low IP if your LFP is on a relative basis low, but your OIP is still high. Small completion would kind of be down here, and an overstimulated rock would typically up here to the left. So that's a simple way of bracketing these terms in a sense. And I use a lot of places here, like oil in place, or I can use pore volume, or I can use gas in place. It really doesn't matter. Like, it's just different ways of quantifying the contacted pore volume. And that comes to the next topic here, which is when we talk about this volume we resolve from RTA, we on purpose use this contacted. We emphasize it's the contacted pore volume. And what do we mean by that? Well, so when we go into a field like this, and we go in and we put 3 wells in the rock, if you like, we go in and complete it, we're not able to contact the whole, call it petrophysically in place volume. And why is that? Well, fractures, they dilate. You might have not 100% cluster efficiency. Your fracture height and fracture length, they might be different for every single cluster, etc. So over time, and we did a study actually last year with the 40-50 companies that was a part of the numerical RTA JIP then, and we asked them, compare the contacted pore volume you get from an RTA exercise to the actual mapped in place volumes, and when from the petrophysical guys. And typically the number they came back with was 20 to 40% of the mapped in place hydrocarbons. So that means that even if you have, let's say you have 20% recovery factor in this contacted pore volume right here, on a full, call it acre basis, you will still have to maybe divide that by at least 3 to 5x. So you'll be far below the number of 10 at that point. Okay. My main point for you guys is that a lot of different shops call this volume a different thing. We call it in the software contacted pore volume, and that was just because the output from that consortium was that most people like to call it the contacted pore volume. Some people call it the stimulated rock volume, and some people use these terms interchangeably. And it's not real for me. It's not really important what you call it. Most importantly is that you just realize that it's a different, that it's not the full and mapped petrophysical oil in place or gas in place that you get from the petrophysicists. And we use the word contacted pore volume in general. How can we quantify it? It can be either of these equations right here. It's I make the joke that it's all the same, but it's different. But you can use all of these terms if you like. The only thing that differs between them is primarily fluid, like PVT and water saturation type of stuff. But it's trying to quantify the same thing. So that's what you'll see if you, in the multiphase F&B method, for instance, if you change any of these numbers, you'll see how they're linked in general. So if you change one, it changes all of the other ones. Awesome. We're still on the introductory part, and one thing that's really important when we talk about I see some comments in the chat here. Great. When it comes to RTA, one thing that we need to have a good grasp on or a good relationship to is this concept of boundaries. I mentioned it all one time already. So you have different types of flow regimes depending on what boundaries you're observing. This model right here is the simplest type of model that you can find, at least for tight unconventionals. Many people call it a one-dimensional model or a symmetry of element model. It is highly used in different commercial packages, etc. And I'll show basically why it's called a one-dimensional model. So here we of course look at it in 2D, but I can assure that this model has no volume beyond the frac tips or the frac heights. So there's only one direction of flow, and that's this flow, this direction right here, which also makes it only to be one boundary, and that boundary is on the side here, right here, to the right. In terms of flow regimes, what that means is that we only have two flow regimes. We have infinite acting flow, and then we have boundary dominated flow. There is no transitional flow in this simple geometry right here. It's impossible to get. And even if we stack them up like this, because they all hit the boundaries at the same point in time, they go, it's the same model, we just add them up together. And you would think, oh, okay, now we have 3 boundaries or 6 or whatever. But since they hit the boundaries at the same point in time, it's still only a so-called one-dimensional model, and the number of boundaries is still, or the flow regimes is still 2. If we make a little bit different model, let's say we have this is a simple model that's really popular to use. This is what we call where you have basically volume beyond the frag tips in this model right here. And in this particular model, we're dealing with 2 different boundaries. It's the boundary here at the side, so basically between different fractures, and at the top here going in, that's basically volume contributing beyond the frag tips. And you actually see we almost go into some kind of radial or pseudo-radial flow here to some degree. And in this case, we're actually dealing with 2 boundaries because we have flow in both of these directions right here, and we're ending up with potentially 3 different flow regimes. We have infinite acting flow, and then once you start to feel these boundaries right here, we're dealing with transitional flow, and then that will be actually in transitional flow for a really, really long time. And then, is that transitional flow actually contributing to any additional volume? Then you can say that you can almost forget about it. But this is in one way to get 3 different flow regimes, and there's an infinite number of ways to get this type of behavior or difference in flow regimes over time. But this is a very typical flow regime type of progression over time that you will see in unconventionals. I know what you're thinking. It's already been too much flow regimes already, but we'll just do one more thing here, as Steve Jobs would say. And that's just a sequence of flow regimes. So if you have 3 different potential flow regimes, what you'll see in tight unconventionals, if you just do the combinations of that, you can only have infinite acting flow for the entire history. That's one potential solution. You can have infinite acting flow followed by transitional flow for the rest of the history. You just haven't reached boundary dominated flow yet. You can have infinite acting flow followed by transitional flow, and then finally boundary dominated flow. You can have infinite acting flow followed by boundary dominated flow, so no transitional flow in between. Transitional flow for the entire history, and we'll be surprised how normal that is. And initially transitional flow followed by boundary dominated flow for the rest of the observed history. And of course the last one, which is less rare, but you can see it in some really, really highly developed parts of the Permian and stuff, basically pseudo-steady state, or what looks like pseudo-steady state for the entire observed history. And if you summarize this as a little bit more simple terminology, this is some different ways or flow regime progressions you can see in general. So if you only simplify your life into these 3 buckets, these are kind of some of the buckets you can or changes over time that you can see. Any questions so far? Or was this hopefully digestible and simple? I raised my hand there. So if you have any questions, feel free to either unmute or just shoot them in the chat. Very, very good. And again, for some of you guys that have joined late here in the course, just remember that you can that the course is recorded. So we'll distribute the course recording after the course today, such that you can access the recording later. And of course, the slides have been sent out already. So now over to RTA, and then the goal of the course is actually for all of you to go through well together with me. Maybe some of you have gone through that well already, so you're more interested in doing kind of the theory part a little bit more in detail. That's totally fine as well. So that will be an optional thing for you guys. But when it comes to RTA and kind of RTA in a nutshell, and what we're going to talk about today is 3 different types of RTA. The way I guess I see it and our shop sees it. The first one is classical RTA. So when people talk about like the square root of the time plot or the specialized plot or the linear flow plot, if you like, that's basically a very, very common workflow. So we'll touch upon that. The reason why it's really important to touch upon is that it has been such an important workflow, I guess commercially and operationally in the industry, that understanding what the moving pieces of that workflow is, its limitations is really important. Then we're going to talk about numerical RTA, or some people call that the Bowie workflow. That is a way to do classical RTA, but just with a numerical model. And the last one is what we call fractional RTA, which some people call kind of Acuna RTA, or there's a few different words of it, but I like to call it fractional. Okay, so before we're going to run through a well together, I'm just going to run you very quickly through these 3 different methodologies, such that you have a relationship to the most important moving pieces and the most important outputs. And again, if there's one thing I want you to take away from this course, it's just that RTA is just LFP or A root K, or the contacted pore volume. That's the only 2 things that we would like to get out from it. And we're going to talk about this in the context of those 2 parameters. So we start with classical RTA that I'm sure at least those of you in the course today that have done a lot of RTA before, you are really familiar with this type of workflow. And a very key part of that workflow, actually the only thing, there's a bunch of other plots there in the workflow, but the most important thing in the workflow is what we call the square root of time plot. And we'll break that plot down for you, but this is what it is. It's just rate normalized pressure versus the square root of time. Very simple stuff. We'll break it down in a sec. And it has a slope, and it has a time to end a linear flow line. And those are kind of the 2 important lines there, okay? So the slope is the first thing that's important. And the second thing is the time to end a linear flow. And I'll break it down to you what these 2 things give you out in a nutshell. So we look at the plot first. What is plotted on the axes? On the y-axis, we have rate to normalized pressure. We'll define that a little bit more strictly later. But for now, the way to calculate it is just to take the initial reservoir pressure divided by the flowing bottom of pressure that day, divided by the rate. So if you plot this for oil, for instance, you will divide that by the oil rate, for instance. But the pressure is the pressure, so it doesn't matter. The most important thing from a slopes perspective is that you can make a slope go through the data like this. You can make it go through the data like this, or you can make it go through the data like this. Obviously, the blue one in the middle there is probably the best fit in this case, but that's not the point here. The point is that the shallower your slope becomes, the larger your LFP is, okay? So the slope is what gives you the LFP. We'll talk more about this later, but slope gives you LFP, or slope gives you the A root K. Probably should have added that to the slide. The second moving piece is the time to end a linear flow. The time to end a linear flow gives you the contacted pore volume. So this is a small OIP, this is a big OIP, and then this is a bigger OIP. And the same goes for OGIP if you do it for gas, okay? So classical RTA is really simple. It's primarily actually one plot that does all the magic. We'll do that later today. And that magic is, okay, the slope gives you the A root K, and the contacted pore volume gives you, or the time to end the linear flow gives you the contacted pore volume. Okay, so I think that's simple enough for everyone. And maybe a few of you knew that already. If you have never used this plot before, that's fine as well. And we'll go through that many times in the software too. Increasing the difficulty level a little bit, we're going to just briefly introduce numerical RTA. We're going to run through a workflow of that later, and then we're going to go through all the nuts and bolts that builds upon the workflow, what's going on in the background. But what is numerical RTA? If you only look at the word numerical RTA, why do we use the word numerical even? Well, the RTA piece, I can start with that because it is simple. We've mentioned that many times, that when I say we're going to do RTA on something, we're going to get the contacted pore volume and we're going to get the LFP parameter out. Those are the 2 things we would like to get out from the workflow. The numerical piece is that, okay, let's try to use a numerical engine and not analytical equations, but a numerical reservoir simulation engine to resolve those parameters for us. And that's why we call this numerical RTA. And it solves a few issues, and that's why we run it numerically. Okay. The problem in a nutshell is really simple that we try to solve with numerical RTA. The problem is simple, is that these classical RTA equations that we use, so basically when we use the square root of time plot that I just introduced, we assume single phase flow and we assume a constant rate or a constant pressure solution. But in reality, we're dealing with both changing rates and pressures, and that's what we call superposition effects. And if we go below saturation pressure, or even if you're just flowing above saturation pressure, but you have water and oil, or water or gas, by definition, you're dealing with a multi-phase flow problem. Okay, so to solve these things, very, very simply, you can use, or we can delegate all of those difficult things to a numerical engine, because a numerical engine can account for superposition rigorously, and it can also account for multi-phase flow effects rigorously if you set it up correctly. Okay, so that's why we use a numerical engine for this. In a nutshell, what will happen if you use the square root of time plot is that you'll get a certain slope as you're plotting points while you are above the bubble point, for instance. And then you'll get a different slope as you go below the bubble point. And this is just due to the artifact of this combination of multi-phase flow and superposition effects. Okay, so if you went in here and you thought that that deviation from the straight line was boundary effects, your analysis would look something like this. You would go in and put the line here, and then again, the line gives you the LFP. And then you would put in a time channel linear flow curve right here, which in most cases is picked too early. So if that is picked too early, then you know, and it looks something like this, you will always end up with a higher permeability, short fracture half length, and justifying more wells per section. Again, this is kind of where people were burning themselves a little bit in the past. Numerical RTA that solves these two inherent problems, so multi-phase flow and superposition effects, basically generates numerically this plot right here. We'll show how that's done a little bit later, where a flat horizontal line indicates infinite acting linear flow. Deviation below this line represents boundary dominated or transitional flow, and the magnitude of the line indicates the LFP itself. And you can think about this, if you like to think about time channel linear flow stuff, you can think about this as this line right here. The second thing that you do is that you run it for a wide range of size of models. So once you have an LFP, you can run it for a bunch of different tank sizes, and the larger the tank size, the longer you'll be in infinite acting flow. And as you go lower and lower on the tank size, you'll enter boundary effects sooner and sooner. So you'll get essentially a type curve for all of those different tanks, and you pick essentially the contacted pore volume that's closest to your data, in addition to the LFP. And what have you done? Well, you've done exactly RTA, what the RTA exercise is. You picked an LFP and you picked a contacted pore volume. And this comes from the work from Braden and James at this from this paper right back in 2020. And again, just connect the dots for all of you that know Dave very well, a very good friend, and was very lucky to teach a course with him a couple of weeks ago up in Denver. You know, the workflow that he's talking about right here, square root of time plot, that workflow right there, the slope gives us the LFP, and the time channel linear flow is what gives us the contacted pore volume. So it gives us exactly the same things as in numerical RTA. It just, we do it numerically versus using the square root of time plot. Inputs are PVT, production data, and it's also rel perms, plus a few other things like pressure dependent permeability, etc. if you would like to include that. So like with any model, even if you wanted to do some of these things analytically, you are always prone to some of these inputs. So there's a few tricks that I'll show you guys on how to make sure that your model makes sense before you start to do the interpretation. Awesome. The last thing we're going to do before we're going to take a break, and then we're going to jump on actually running through a case together, is what we call fractional RTA. And fractional RTA is really simple, or it's not simple, but it's simple to explain what the problem is. So all these classical RTA techniques that I talked about, whether it's numerical RTA or classical RTA, they assume equally spaced fractures. Well, in reality, we're dealing with something that's much more complicated. It can look something like this, or it can look something like this. This is what we call an uneven frac spacing setup. So that means that you'll basically get into boundary dominated flow here first, and then here, and then you'll be in infinite acting flow for a longer time between here. So you get this combination of infinite acting flow and boundary dominated flow, this transitional flow period that fractional RTA tries to address. So classical RTA basically solves only for an equally spaced fracture network. So when delta is 0.5, that gives us a square root k. While fractional RTA, that comes from Jorge and his work at Chevron there, solves for complex systems of fractures. So it gives you a k to the delta, and that delta can be essentially any value, typically between 0.5 and 0. It can also be higher than that, but that means a few other things, so we'll skip that for now. So that only means actually that your LFP definition changes a little bit, just to AK to the delta. How do you get delta? Well, you can plot the rate normalized pressure plot versus time, and you can plot fit the parallel through that. And again, this is exactly the same plot as you're plotting in the square root of time plot. The only difference is that this guy is not in square root of time; it's just in time. And you plot it like this, and you fit a parallel through it, and the inverse of that is your delta. What does delta mean? Infinite acting linear flow, so delta of 0.5. Boundary dominated flow gives you a delta of 0, and anything in between there will give you a delta between 0 and 0.0. So with that, I think, yeah, let's actually do one quick thing, all of us, just make sure that we're all set up with the software appropriately before we're going to run a quick workflow. So I think we all have some of the basics now in terms of what the different methodologies are giving us, etc. And I thought we could just really fast go into the software right now. Go to courses.whitson.com. And before we take the break, I want to make sure that everybody has wells in their projects, and that we run a calculation such that if some of you guys have issues, we can make sure that we fix that before the break is over. So I'd like everybody to log in to the tool. That login information is what I provided right here. So go to courses.whitson.com, use your email as the login, and the password should be Whitson with a capital W, RTA 2023. Okay, so I'll just leave that on the screen for 15 more seconds. Okay. If anybody has some issues, just write in the chat here. Yeah.
Good question. I'm not able to see the web page right now. Would you share your screen with the web page again?
This?
I have the whitson.com/courses, but I don't think this is the one.
Okay, let's you probably sometimes if you depends on the browser, sometimes the browser fills in the HTTPS. So in the chat there.
Okay.
Yeah, so just include and I've seen that sometimes, like if you don't get the HTTPS there, it I think it looks.
Let me try.
Yeah, perfect. So I think if you just do like this, yeah, Chrome adds it, but I think maybe Edge adds it as well. Yeah, it's a little bit browser specific, and I recommend to use Edge or Chrome. In general, all these browsers should work, but just don't use Safari, or it doesn't matter for this course. But yeah, perfect.
It's awesome. Working fine. But can I see the password again, please? Thank you.
Yeah, perfect. Down here to the right.
Perfect. Thank you. which email address we should use? The work email address?
Yeah, your own email address, yeah.
Mine doesn't work, but let me try again. RTA. Yeah. Well, there's a star at the end.
Does it work now?
I'm trying it with the start. I don't know if anybody else is able to log in.
Yeah, the maybe we can follow up on that in the break, Teja. With
Sure.
yeah. So Teja's checking here for you now. You have her email and everything.
I'll get it from the.
Yeah, there we go. Okay.
I got into. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. But everybody else has been able to log in, okay? Just give a thumbs up in the reaction or whatever they do there. Yeah, perfect, awesome. Yeah, good. So when you get in there, what we're gonna do is go to RTA course right here. I see all the projects because I have a support access, but you should only see your project. And I would like you to just go into your project, and I'll say I'll call mine Matthias RTA course 2023. You should already have a project created for you, so you can just click that project. And I'll show. So basically, when the project looks like this, you'll probably be called your email or something like that, I think. If it's called your email, just click it, and then you should be in this interface right here. And once that's good, I'll go through the next steps with everyone there. Okay. So last thing I would like us to do just before we take a break is, and I will make sure to help Casal with that login. She's in.
Can you check? I think she's in.
Yeah. So, yeah, we'll check with that just in a sec. Okay, so if you're in here, inside of your project, we'll go to the manual right here, user manual up to the right. And under where it says, and we'll go through all these details in a sec, and under where it says certification, you're going to find a few wells that we're going to use for the examples here. If you guys have done, some of you will probably have done some of this before, but for at least a couple of the wells. But that's under certification here. So under onboarding, certification. Then download the relevant data here. It's under 1.3. And I'll actually copy that link and send that here. And so you can either click the link that I sent you in the chat here on Teams, or you can go here and click it. And once you just save it somewhere on your computer, if you have Chrome, that's why I like Chrome, you can just leave it be down here to the left. And once you save that, go back to the software, up to the right, click mass upload, and just drag and drop the file into the interface right there. Then you should have 3 wells coming in there. Okay, so I'll show that one more time. Just make sure that at the top here, you're in the field called RTA course. You're in the project called whatever your email is. And then you have clicked mass upload here under the well level and drag and drop that file into the interface right here. And then click save down to the right. If you can't see the save button right there, it just means that you've zoomed in too much or too little. So I recommend to use an 80% zoom in the browser. We'll touch upon a few of those things after the course today. Okie doke. Perfect. And then before taking a break now, we're going to take a 10-minute break now in a minute. I just would like everybody to go into the first well on the list here, called Kite, just by clicking that to the well, and then go to PVT. We click the well, and then we go into PVT. Then in reservoir fluid composition, just open that reservoir fluid composition card. I'll show that again. So in the well list, click Kite, go to PVT. In reservoir fluid composition, just open that card, and you can make it 750, or you can drag and drop this line right here, just something that makes sense for you. And again, if you don't see the save button down to the right, you need to zoom out, Control minus, and just click save when that's done. And then the software does its magic and it predicts a fluid composition for us. And we'll use this as a basis to learn a little bit about the zoom before we're going to do the RTA way. Awesome. So we'll take a 10-minute break now. We'll be back at 9:15 a.m. Houston time, so that's in 10 minutes. If you need help, log in or to add wells. Perfect. Okay, so we'll be back here in 9 minutes from now. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started again. Looks like everybody's been pretty okay to log in and everything, so that's been good. So just before we get started on some of the RTA specific things, I need to run through some of the software basics just in short. The first thing that I mentioned, and it is very important, is related to the zooming. And this is not your fault, it's probably my fault, but just up to the right here, make sure that your zoom is not set to 100%. Of course, it's dependent on what screen size you're on and also what feels good for your eye. But all the way up to the right in the browser, you can set the zoom. You can also use Control Plus or Control Minus to make sure that you have a zoom that makes sense for you. Okay, so that's and how do you actually know what zoom makes sense or not? If you ever have to ask yourself the question, where's my zoom button? Like good example of like if you're going to do this stuff later and you can't see the zoom button like this, or a save button, you know that okay, you have to scroll down this. That means that you need to zoom out. Okay, so I'm on this engineering screen at least. I like to use 75%. So that was the first thing. Second thing, to get some more real estate on the screen, you can click F11 like this to make sure that all this hidden stuff below and above is removed. For some people, that might also be function F11, F11. That depends on the person. You can also get some more real estate in the horizontal direction if you click the menu up here to the left. That's the what we call the hamburger menu, or up here. So that removes this this navigation panel to the left. That brings me to the next thing, that this menu to the left here, that's what we call the navigation panel, and that will have all of the features. And again, we ran the PVT now because we need the PVT as an input. So a lot of things happening there that I'll not go into detail of, but in a nutshell, we created the fluid composition, used that to create a face envelope. That was used to create these PVT tables. These PVT tables can be exported to any third-party tool, or they're used everywhere in the software where you need PVT. Like analytical RTA, numerical RTA, and a numerical model that we're going to use today, we're going to use these tables basically. And everything is equation of state based, so there is an equation of state in the background here. This is what we call a so-called default equation of state. So you'll see that this equation of state is kind of a vanilla envelope Ping-Robinson equation of state that's not tuned to any data. But for the sake of this course, we should be okay. Okay, so that's the PVT part, probably the only thing I'll run into on the PVT part. At the top here, you'll see the structure of the tool. So basically, you'll be in a field, you'll be in a project, and under a project, you're in a well. You can filter the well list up here. So you know, if you, let's say you have a huge project with you know, hundreds of wells and stuff, and you only would like to have 5 wells in that well list, you as a user can put in those 5 wells here, or you can create a well group and make sure that you only use that well group, etc. And that's a way to filter down to that group. And under each well, you have the layer called analyses. So what I would like all of you guys to do now, just so you've done it, is to click this this button right here at the top here on the main, and it says analysis. So this guy right there, and then click this button called add new analysis. Call it whatever, test, and see what happens. So once you do that, the software is creating a new analysis under the well level. And you can access all the analysis by clicking View All Analyses here. Or up to the right here, there's an info button that we'll talk more about later. You can click this info button right here, and it brings you into this well info screen right here. And here you'll see all the different analyses at the bottom for this particular well. And multiple different users can create different analysis for the same well. And by default, those analyses are so-called private. So you're the only one in the company that can see it. But if you'd like to change any of that, you can go ahead and make it company-wide down there to the right. Okie doke. So that's the hierarchy in the software. There is a release coming out now, so actually that's coming out very soon. So there you'll actually see that the analysis will be like a 4th level here down to in the navigation panel. So that will just bring you exactly to the same screen as when you click this icon right here, or if you click this icon, view all analysis right there, or if you actually went to the well and clicked the well info there. There's just a shorter way to click and get into that. Once you're inside of a well, up to the right here, there's previous and next well icons. So if you click that, you'll get to the next well in the project. And once you're at the last well in the project, you'll loop around. This is the GIS functionality up here. This is where you can download and upload generated files. This is where you change your unit system. This is where you provide a support ticket if you have any issues. You can also just send an email to support@whitson.com. And the last thing here is what we call the user manual. So let's say we're in the PVT feature right now and we click the user manual, you'll be brought straight into the relevant part of the user manual. Okay. So again, if I click the user manual, depending on what part of the software you're in, obviously, if I'm in the numerical model and I click the user manual, I'll be brought into the relevant part of the manual right here. What you'll also see is that the navigation panel here to the left, this panel right here, is a 100% replica of the navigation panel here to the left. So it should be easy to navigate within the manual as well once you're kind of in there, if that makes sense. Yeah. Last thing I'll mention here is related to these these cards right here. Like this stuff right here that has all the reservoir fluid stuff in it, that's what we call a reservoir fluid composition card. This is what we call the surface process input card. Here we have the well data card. Here we have the well and reservoir data card, the fluidization card, the relative permeability card. The reasons why we have these cards is that they encapsulate input. The nice thing about the reason why we do it is to make it a little bit easier on the eye for you to not like have everything exposed in your face, especially if there's a lot of options. Like here, you could change like different methods with the full compositions and the separator compositions, etc. So it's a little bit easier for you to digest. So at least that's the thought about it. And to open all of these input cards, you need to click the edit button up to the right. That is the functionality in general. Yeah. Last thing I'll just mention here is when it comes to if something is not working on your screen, let's say you ran this calculation, but for some reason it didn't show up, or you had bad internet connection for a period of time, you haven't logged into the system for a period of time, etc. Just remember to refresh your front end. So click Control-R and refresh, such that you make sure that you can deal with any issues, or at least before contacting support. That's a good thing. The next things we're going to do now is to go and actually run a quick workflow, only the RTA features for a given well. We're going to do it kind of fast, clicking the buttons a little bit, such that we have a little bit of background for the next piece of the theory. And then we're going to run through more wells, look at much more cases. We're going to look at some derivative analysis stuff. We're going to look at some advanced features as well that we typically don't get time to go into in these in-person courses. Just before we get there, I'm going to do two things on the zooming of the plots. The zooming of the plots needs a little bit of training to get up to speed, but once you get there, it's all good. So to zoom the min and max portion of the axis, you need to go all the way up to the upper left portion of the plot, click one time, and type in a number. So everybody saw that. If you're all the way up at the end of the axis, you click. You type in 10,000, for instance, it works like this. Same down here. And you can even do it in any part of the software actually like this. So that's, or also on the negative axis like this. Once you've done any zooming activities and you want to reset the zoom, the reset button is always up here to the right. This is the icon for that. This is the downloaded data that you see here to Excel. Yeah, so that's the two biggest, most important things. When it comes to the axis, if I want to just do it by drag and drop like this, I have to be all the way in the end of the axis. If I'm in the middle, you see what happens is that my plot is just going to the right or to the left. It doesn't keep the origin fixed. Okay. And last thing is on the legend that we'll use a little bit today. If you single click the legend will disappear. If you double click the legend, that will only keep that legend there. And if you double click it again, everything else will appear. Awesome. Okay, so that's just the basics on the zooming. So for this well right now, everybody should have PBT for their well. So everybody should have PBT for their well right here. So when it comes to the PBT, just go from PBT to bottom hole pressures. We're not going to run the bottom hole pressures, but I would like everybody to be in this part of the software right now. Okay, so we've gone from PBT down to bottom hole pressure, and we're not going to run anything. We're just going to use the uploaded gauge pressures in this example, and we will click at the top here from measured bottom hole pressure. We're going to click custom PWF. And what's going to happen when you click that button is that you get this interface up right here. Okay. So can people say when they're kind of here? Okay, perfect. There we go. So once we're here, we're going to just do something really fast. We're going to click auto fit. And this is a way for you to fit the data fast. And as I was saying, last year I saved 2 years of my life with this feature because before that I had to do this in Excel. Super painful. But so this is a really popular feature. And you can move some of the data points around. You can also go in here and add some points in between these points right here. And the way to do that is that you click this add points button up to the right. And then you can add those points in between these data points right here. You can also move them around. And if you would like to delete a point, you can just take that point and drag it what I call south of the border. Just drag it into negative y-axis territory right there. Okay, so again, if you want to delete the point, you can do that. There's also a lasso remove point option right here that I'll show later. Again, so when you're happy with that, just click save. And now you should have two options right here. And you should also at the top here pick basically the custom bottom hole pressure. So if you then went into like numerical model, you'll see that the bottom hole pressure is right here versus time, and it's the custom bottom hole pressure. So that's a smoothed bottom hole pressure. Okay. So stop me if I'm going too fast now. Just write in the chat, stop. I haven't gotten this far. We should have PBT and we should have bottom hole pressure right now. And of course, we have production data already right here. Yeah. The first thing that I always do when I go into a new well is once I have PBT production data and bottom hole pressures is that I go straight to this feature right here called analytical RTA. And you can kind of think about, you know, the PNR plot right here, the pressure normalized rate plot. You can almost think about that as a type curve with units. That's how we can think about that. And all of these plots are basically trying to tell you something about the well performance. So the plots we have in this feature right here is a square root of time plot. It's a pressure normalized rate plot. It's just bottom hole pressure versus whatever time function you've picked. And you have also just oil rate versus the time function that you picked. And we'll spend a little bit of time here since this is course, only on related to the RTA pieces. We'll spend a little bit of time here running through some of the options to the left. The first thing we can see here to the left is that we can pick between two different time functions. That's real time and it's material balance time. By default, we use material balance time. So that's everybody here knows Tom Blassingame, for instance. He's kind of Mr. Material Balance Time and to some degree. And there's some good reasons for why we use that as a default and why that's the case in most softwares and workflows in the industry. You could go and pick real time here if you change that at the top, and then you see real time versus real data versus time here. Okay, I think everybody sees that. So if I would like everybody to flip to real time here right now. The other thing you can do is to flip between different phases. So this is an oil, like a kind of low GOR oil, so doing it on oil makes sense, but in theory, you could go ahead and flip it to gas, to water, liquid rate, total reservoir, etc. That will probably change the graphs a lot, but we can see here, yeah, so this is water. This is if you do it for gas, so this is associated gas above saturation pressure. You have a liquid in the reservoir option, and you have a total reservoir fluid option as well. So there's a few different options here on the face. So just to explain the difference, the oil is using surface rates for oil. The gas uses surface only, and all gas uses surface rates only for gas. Water uses only for water. Very popular for people who do like flowback analysis type of work. You can use this feature to only use the flowback. Then we have the liquid kind of reservoir. The total liquid, that's basically water and oil converted with PVT from surface to reservoir barrels. And the total does that with both oil, water, and gas to a kind of a reservoir barrels versus time. Okay, so that's the different options. And I would like everybody to be back in real time and oil phase right now. All the plots here to the right, they can be expanded by clicking this button right here. You can also collapse them. So I'll just show that by clicking that button just one time. So that's for all of these. One thing we have included on purpose is in the legend here for the square root of time plot, you can see that some points are marked as undersaturated and some points are marked as saturated. So what this means is that based on the saturation pressure from the PVT, which in this case is 2,800 or 2,900-ish, the points who are above the saturation pressure, they have a lighter green, and the points below has a darker green. So I can go in here and I can say, I can take these points right here and toggle them off. So these will be only the single phase part of the data, where it's only oil and water, I guess. And then as I go below saturation pressure, we're getting this other slope right here. So in this case, the first thing I'm seeing is like, there's things going on. Is there like a slope change as we go below the saturation pressure? Then I should be a little bit skeptical, maybe, of interpreting this as a true boundary effect. But maybe this is too early to tell as well. Okay, so a lot of people, when it comes to just like getting that first feel of the data, they love to go in here, maybe look at it in real time, look at it in material balance time, and get a opinion, a first order opinion at least, of what flow regime I'm in. That's the first thing, the first bucket, flow regime identification. That's where we're right now. And a few kind of classical ways of doing that would be to go to the pressure normalized rate plot that we see right here. We can expand it as well, which I'm doing right now. And all the way up to the right, there's some slopes. Those slopes are unit slopes, half slopes, and quarter slopes. And we'll talk about what that means a little bit later. But again, I expanded that right now. But all the way up here, you can add slopes. So we'll start with a half slope. And to move that half slope around, you'll see that it actually overlays the time to linear flow data. You can overlay that to the part of the data that makes sense. You can add a quarter slope if you want to early. That's typically, indication of bilinear flow, or that you have some kind of skin or damage early, or low fracture connectivity. And then late time, you can add a so-called unit slope like this. And you can do this in real time or material balance time, etc. So that's a way for you to see, okay, for the period of time here, it looks like we're in infinite acting linear flow. And then late time, maybe based on this data, unless that's just noise, it looks like we might be going into boundary dominated flow. So that's some very early diagnosis of this stuff right here. And we haven't even done any RTA work, right? We haven't tried to get a LFP and all that stuff yet. Yeah. The next thing that we're going to do now, so this is just, again, first bucket. And when I talk about these buckets, I talk about these guys right here. These guys right here, flow regime diagnostics. That's what we're dealing with right now. And since we're going to do this for one well, I'll show that later how we can do relative performance between different wells. We just need to do it for one well first. So now we're going to go through kind of the next step, which is quantifying an A root K and quantifying a contacted pore volume. To do that with this feature, I always like to click the auto fit option up to the left as a starting point at least. And everybody can see that or how that works here up to the left. And that will try to fit a straight line portion of the data. That should coincide with the period of time. That's at least what the algorithm is trying to do, where there's a half slope on the PNR plot. Okay, that goes back to this. That goes back to this topic right here. Oops, this topic right here. That when we quantify a root K, you should do that when you observe infinite acting linear flow in a classical workflow. Okay. So when there is basically when there's a half slope on this plot right here, I can remove these other slopes, just unit slope and quarter slope, and maybe there's this infinite acting slope here as well. So whenever this initial period here is a cleanup period, we'll talk about that a little bit later. The second period right here, that's when you get into or when you basically see a half slope, that's when you should try to pick this LFP period right here. And how do you, or when and how do you know? Well, you have this time to end linear flow line that you can change in all the different plots. Then a question that a lot of people ask about is like, okay, what is actually happening after this line right here? And in all the softwares in the workflows there, you can toggle that period on right here. But that period, that is just an empirical period right here. Okay, so you can toggle that on, and you can change that B parameter after to be whatever. But that's just empirical stuff that you're inputting afterwards. Okay, so if I made that a B factor of 2, it would look like this. That's not a good fit, and you should, expect that's a B factor of something less than 1. Okay, so that's everything after that black line, 100% empirical stuff. Okay, and the only thing that actually is used in the software when it comes to resolving reservoir parameters in this classical RTA workflow is basically using the slope and the time to end linear flow to give us this LFP estimate and the contacted pore volume estimate. And I'll show how that all works together right now. So if I expand this right now, we're going to go into kind of the third bucket, quantifying an LFP and the contacted pore volume. I think I'm smarter than the software, so I'm just going to change my my interpretation a little bit, like this. Again, this is single phase everything, and what I would like to show you is up here to the left. When I change the slope here, and again, to change the slopes, you just need to be at the end of the slope like this when it becomes a hand. So if I make the LFP steeper, you see, or the slope steeper, my LFP goes down, and vice versa. So if I make this shallower, this number goes up. So the first learning, this line is what gives us the contact, the LFP right here. Once you have set this LFP in stone, this line right here, when I move this to the left, my contacted pore volume goes down, and when I move this to the right, it goes up. So that's the basics there. So in a classical RTA workflow, that's the two moving pieces you care about. And once you've picked an LFP and contacted pore volume, you can come up with assumptions of porosity, lateral length, fracture height, number of fractures, etc. And you can resolve a matrix permeability and fracture half length. Okay, but then you're basically assuming that after this point right here, after this line right here, we're in full boundary dominated flow. That's what you assumed. Okay, in this workflow. Personally, I primarily use this feature not to resolve these two parameters right here, but I personally use it for diagnostics. And I'll show some of the other diagnostics that are a little bit more advanced later. And I also use it for flow regime identification. At the top here, you'll similarly see that there's an option for fractional. All the way at the top there. So you can change from classical to fractional. And it has a very similar interface. And the only primarily difference here is this rate normalized pressure plot. It's not square root of time here, it's just material balance time. And in classical, you see that there's material balance square root of time, and then in fractional, you see that it's just material balance time, and it's plotted log-log. And this delta parameter that I talked about earlier, you can change that delta parameter, but initially it's 0.5 like this. So after the cleanup period, it looks like we're on a trend of 0.5 for a period of time. And then maybe late time, when it goes to 0, we can kind of agree that we're, if we trust this data, etc., that we're seeing probably a delta of 0. So at some point here, before going into numerical workflows and stuff, my bias would be that this model right here is, at the end of history at least, is in boundary dominated flow. That's my current interpretation. Okay, and you can change. You can also do an auto fit and stuff here, and it might try to fit something in between here. And in the next release, you'll be able to put in a bunch of different slopes and stuff in this plot too. Okay, so we've used basically two different techniques real fast here, and we'll see some delta parameters that are very different later. But just as a first pass, these are kind of a couple of the first things that I typically look for here. There's a lot of moving pieces here, but just remember the basics: line, LFP, time to nonlinear flow, contacted pore volume. And in terms of LFP, typically for oil wells at least, this number right here is a lower estimate of what you should have in your numerical model, because your numerical model typically has a moving water phase as well. Awesome. Any questions here? Or is it too easy or too hard? But okay, I think we're clear on this. So we know how to add slopes. We know how to move the lines. We know what's being plotted. And we can have an opinion on what flow regime we think this well is at the end of history. I think we're good there. And we also know, yeah.
Where's that auto fit button again? I know it was on every chart. I think it was available, but can you point at the auto fit real fast for me?
It's up here to the left, right there.
Highlighted in bright. Okay, and that's fractional or classical. It still works.
Yeah, exactly.
Thanks.
That's great. It's. We've kind of tried to find a way to. I think what we've done in the software now. That's actually a great comment from Kenneth there. In general, if people wonder where to run stuff, all the run buttons in every single feature should be in primary kind of Whitson blue up to the left. And if there's several options of things to run, it should be there. So we'll see that in the numerical model, in the numerical RTA model. I think in nodal there should be similar bottom up pressure, etc. So that can be it's more of a general note for people if you haven't used software that much yet. That the run buttons and stuff, they will be up to the left, and typically like export functionality and that kind of stuff would be many times up to the right here. That's at least how we were trying to design it. Okay, so we've done some basics now. So this is the basic classical RTA, a little bit of the fractional RTA stuff analytically, and now we're going to go into numerical RTA. And before running numerical RTA right here, I would like everybody to go down to numerical RTA, and then in numerical RTA, you could either do this or I can just show you, but if you click the user manual up to the right, and this is a little bit important, there is some important parts of the manual that I like to go through here. I probably should have included as slides in the course, but here we are. But I realized that these are really important, really important. The first thing in numerical RTA is just to realize what are the inputs and what are the outputs. Or like to just emphasize what the inputs and outputs are. The first thing, and we kind of touched upon it, like it's of course production data, bottom up pressure data, it's PVT, and then there's a few other things. And highlighted in color, those inputs can be found here down to the right, or left, sorry. So everything that you see in this interface from fracture connectivity and down to rel perms are inputs to the model. To edit the rel perms, we need to click this button right here. The reason why is just if we didn't do it like that, it would be just really invasive at the bottom here. So we just have it down there. So everything from dimensionless fracture connectivity and down are inputs, which means that if you change any of this input, you would have to rerun the numerical RTA feature. That said, the beauty of the method is that if any of the things above here is changed, you do not have to rerun anything. Okay, so a lot of people is like they change their LFPs and contact these pore volumes and they run it again, and you don't have to do that. So all the stuff above here, from matrix permeability and up, they're in outputs from the methodology. Okay, and that's what we're trying to highlight here. So this is a run button, and then these are inputs, and these are outputs. Okay, and this is just emphasized here. The second thing is a few practical aspects that we spend a lot of time on because unlike with like analytical RTA, since it's only dealing with a single phase, and you assume a lot of people think that you're not, you don't need rel perms as an input here, but you've actually assumed implicitly a rel perm set in the background here. You just don't see it. But here, when you do this, since it's just like rates and pressures and that over time, you can kind of click out of it and draw some lines and stuff. So there's not really much to initialize the model with, if that makes sense. In numerical RTA, it's a little bit different. You need to make sure before you even interpret the main diagnostic plot that you have ensured that you are matching the stabilized water cuts and that you have a decent match on your GORs before you interpret the diagnostic plot. This can be changed with changing a few different inputs that I'll talk about. This is primarily a function of PVT and rel perms, and then you're ready to go. The first thing, which is the stabilized water cuts item, to change that, there's really few things to increase or decrease water production in these models. The one way is to change the initial water saturation, or is to change the Connaught water saturation, or it's to change the water rel perm exponents. You basically have 4 different things that you can change there. In general, and how we're going to treat it in this course, is that we have gotten the water saturation from the petrophysicist, and they are in this thought scenario. We're going to just assume that they're extremely stubborn. So we're not allowed to change this number right here. But so this water saturation number will not be able to change. So what are left then on that particular list? So if we go back into the numerical RTA input right here, What's left is the Connacht water saturation and the rel perm exponents. And that we can find here on the rel perms. So the Connacht water saturation is this guy up here to the left. And then we have these two rel perm exponents. All the stuff we see here is just default Coreys, the default Corey exponents. That's it. So we're going to leave these exponents by default, and I like to change stuff as little as possible from defaults as possible. That was a lot of possible in one sentence, I realized, but here we are. So just for example purposes now, let's just decrease this Connacht water saturation to 5%, for instance, just to elaborate on what we're talking about right here. So I'd like everybody to, in the rel perm overview here, just make sure that you reduce this to 5 from 20. Okay, so that's like one input that can be changed. And we haven't even done any runs now, but typically you would run it once, and then you would make some of these adjustments to make sure that it matches. Okay, so that's the first thing. And this is just an example of how that's changed. The second thing is that you want to make sure that your GORs are matching decently. So above the saturation pressure, your GORs will be equal to your solution. Your producing GOR should be equal to the producing GOR. But below the saturation pressure, there's a ton of things that can impact your GOR performance. And that can be a mix of PVT, relative permeabilities, fracture conductivity, pressure-dependent permeability, and flow regimes. And there's a whole part of the manual that discusses this. Like how does fracture conductivity impact GOR as you below saturation pressure? How does geomechanical effects do that? And there's a really nice deck here that can be accessed for those that are interested in that I've sent a link to in the chat. Okay, that talks about this. But that's basically the second thing we need to make sure of here. So again, so just to emphasize that we have to change stuff on that, in the SGC here, let's just change the critical gas saturation to 0 from 5. What the critical gas saturation is like, okay, it needs to build up until that particular gas saturation for the oil to be, for the gas to be mobile. In this data set, however, you can actually see that we don't really see a dip in GOR before it goes up. It's primarily just going straight up. So the critical gas saturation in this case is most likely not really high. Okay, so before we click run now, I'd like everybody to just make sure that we have this input right here. So in relative perms in the matrix, 5% water saturation, Connacht water saturation, and SGC to be 0. Okay, and then after that, we just click save. And once we're happy with that, we can just go to the top here and we will click run. So what all of us are doing right now is that all of us at the same time are running 5-6 full physics reservoir simulation models on the cloud at the same time. So I don't know how many models that is. If we're like 20 people or something, that's like 100 models. Yeah, so that's what we're going to do now in numerical RTA. And I'll show how we interpret this in a second. To the left here, we have grid refinement, so different types of grid refinement depending on what level of grid refinement you'll like to have. We'll talk about that in a sec. Here's also an option of how many type curves you'd like to plot out on the plot in general. Default it's 5, you can change it to 10. You can also change them on a relative basis how big the contacted pore volume is depending on the size there. So that depends on yeah, that debate basically depends on the company, I guess, or the type of well that you're looking at. I see now it takes a lot of time, so I'm assuming that that's because we run it at the same time here, or I need to send this to a colleague real quick just to see what's, yeah, there we go. Perfect. Okay, so I'll walk through these pieces just a little bit step by step. The first thing, as we talked about, our water saturation or water cuts. We would like to make sure we match stabilized water cuts. So that's the first thing I'm checking. Here, I probably would like to have increased this a little bit to make it perfect. But for this first round of going through the workflow, I'll not spend any time on that, but probably to make it very good. And I know some of you guys in the audience have seen some of your matches, and they're way better than mine. So I'll just leave it at that. The second thing that we would like to look at is just the GORs to make sure that we're kind of within the spread here. And it looks like at least this type curve right here looks to be at least in line with historical data. This is probably close enough. And then we're basically made the two checkboxes that we like to make sure that we've checked, that our GORs are fairly in line and the water cuts are fairly in line. Maybe here we might have liked to have the spread a little bit further down, but again, in this example right here, we're not going to spend too much energy on that. So most of you guys now will have a something that looks like this. Fundamentally, I'll go through a few of these different options that is in this interface. The first thing is this line right here that you can drag vertically down or horizontally down. That line right there, that is your A-root-K, your A-root-K parameter. So you see when I change this number, I can also type that number in. And you can do that in old flow material balance, RTA, etc. You can change this, just enter, and it changes like that. Okay. So once you're happy with that, so basically this is how you change the LFP parameter. And then you see the software picks the type curve or the stem that's closest to the observed data. So if I move this LFP a little bit down, it will start to pick this type curve. If I move it further up, it will start to pick this type curve. And then in addition to that, I as a user can override it. So if I click this type curve right here, it transfers up there. If I click this guy right there, it transfers, and the same goes here. Okay, so that's how you change the type curve. Let's say I wanted to make, if this is my interpretation of what the LFP is, and we'll talk about why we would probably pick something like this. And here I see I have a type curve that's 900, and I have a type curve that's 550, and I would like to pick some kind of average of those two. So that's just doing that math quickly here on my calculator, dividing that by 2, that should be 733. Let's just assume I would like to pick that, 733. I can then go in and overwrite that and lock that in. So no matter how I change my LFP, etc., I will then use that number. And here you see that number will give me something in between these two type curves right here. So I know I'll get a really good history match. And you can also see the same here. We'll do a really good thing on gas. And it's also pretty good here on GORs. So picking something in between there is something I feel good with. What we also could have done to get more type curves like this would be to increase it to 10 and rerun. Because I want you guys to get through this workflow real fast, and we'll spend a little bit more time on the other ones. We'll just go ahead and skip that for now. Okay, so now I would like you to have a number that's probably closer to 40,000. Up here, you can lock it in if you like. If you lock it in, you can't move this line up and down. So once you have 40,000 and 733, then I'd like you to click export here up to the right. Before clicking export, I'll just show you guys that there is some ways that you can basically look at the rates versus time as well, if you like to. And you can also toggle this to use like the instantaneous LFP, which you guys don't know what is yet. So there's a few advanced things here that we'll touch upon in the next iteration around. Okay, and again, our interpretation of LFP and OIP is provided up here. And then we've used those to resolve these parameters right here. And that can be done in an infinite number of ways, an infinite number of realizations. But we see one thing, and that's what you see very typically in general, is that compared to analytical RTA, our factor half-lengths are longer and our perm is lower. That's very, very typical for the same input. Okay, so that's what we're looking at right here. Good. So only last thing, click export. what that export thing does. So if you click that button right there, by clicking yes, the reservoir properties result from numerical RTA will overwrite the existing data in the numerical model for this well. And that's the next model down here. So if you click yes, you'll be brought straight into this interface right here. And the data has been updated with your interpretation from numerical RTA. So your well and reservoir data has gotten that information. Your fluid initialization is the same. Your relative permeability inputs are 5 in WC and 0 in SGC. And you can then go ahead and click run. And you should be then off to the races. And at the top here, you have different types of grid refinement that you can pick depending on what you like to do. But we'll talk about grid refinement and well controls and stuff later. Okay. So hopefully everybody's gotten to something like this. We will not worry too much about water for now. We'll talk more about that a little bit later. But here we get a pretty good history match on the first run. So you can kind of think about numerical RTA, and I think why it's become so popular is that it's a really systematic approach to getting a really, really good history match in a really consistent manner. And that's why I love it, because I remember when I didn't have this kind of framework, history matching 12 wells could be like a month's type of work. Okay, and the last thing we'll do here in this workflow, now we have this numerical model, is to add a forecast. And to add a forecast, you click include forecast here at the top. And again, I just want to make sure that everybody has been able to, in the numerical RTA here, if you click export, you need to click export here in the right menu to bring those, and click yes, to bring those results into the numerical model before you click run. And you have to have run it once before you include the forecast. So when you include a forecast here, you can have a parametric decline. Just for now, you can, and this is for you to just show that you can change the parametric decline. Let's just go in here and make this a constant bottom hole pressure. And let's just make it, 10,000 days or so. Okay, and I'll just go ahead and click save, and we'll show the parametric decline a little bit later. So now you just run it for 30 years simulation model. And again, this is a full physics simulation model that you can export into any third-party tool. Up here to the right, CMG, Eclipse, Intersect, OPM Flow, Sensor, etc. And you should get exactly the same as the black lines in any of those tools, okay, that you simulate for here. And in this case, if we trust our assumptions and stuff, and we say that this well is going to produce for 30 years, our EUR for this is around 150. Awesome. Any questions for this? Or is that simple enough? Okay, perfect. Goody. So what we're going to do now is take a quick break again, a 10-minute break. After the break, we're going to run through a little bit more theory. We're going to kind of detailed theory. We on the different methods, just to make sure that you know how things work together. And once we're done with that, we will go through a lot of some more advanced things. So things that you don't learn in school, as they say. So that'll be fun. So hopefully it's just getting more spicy from here. But let's just get back here in 10 minutes. Okay. So we'll continue here. So again, a little bit more theory now, just to talk a little bit more about what's happening behind the scenes when we click the buttons, if that makes sense. So again, RTA has been the main topic of what we talk about today, and I set up the important things I'll at least repeat twice. So I think we'll do that here now. So from RTA, we can derive two properties. It's your A root K, and it's your contacted pore volume. As I mentioned before, this term to the left correlates with 1 year cums, or like short-term production, however you like to look at it. And this correlates with the EURs. The one to the left there is observed during infinite acting linear flow, and the one to the right is observed during boundary dominated flow. So if you've never heard about what A root K or LFP is before, but you've worked in conventionals in the past, Sam also has this great analogy, or whatever we would like to call it, that the A root K is just a sideways KH. So for those who have worked conventional reservoir, KH is like a huge topic. What's a KH? It's a big driver for productivity, essentially. And you can think about A root K as kind of the same thing, just for or A root K being the same thing just for unconventional reservoirs. So the difference is very simple. In conventional reservoirs, we're hunting for KH, and in unconventional reservoirs, we're trying to get this A root K. And this A root K parameter, at least for the geometries, like for a simple geometry like this, then the A root K will be basically the area generated by this, the fractures that are subject to flow, multiplied with the square root of permeability. Okay, again, it's just the area generated by flow multiplied with the square root of permeability. That number, if you want to calculate it for this type of geometry right here, it's basically, I don't know if you guys see it, but when I toggle back and forth here, it's the gray area right here. And if you think about it, the distance here, it's 2 times the frac half length. It's multiplied with the h of the fracture, and you have to multiply with the number of fractures. That's the area of one of these guys right here. But then we multiply with, you see, it's not 2 times NF times XF, but it's 4 times. So the reason for that is that there's flow from both sides onto that fracture. Okay, does that make sense? So the surface area subject to flow is, whatever the surface area of this thing is, and then multiplied by 2 again, because we get flow from both sides. And that's what the definition of your so-called linear flow parameter is. Then we have the contacted pore volume. That's just a hydrocarbon pore volume divided by a formation volume factor to convert those reservoir volumes to surface. So for this geometry again, if we assume that our world is, there's no frac volume beyond the frac tips, etc., that will be basically the volume of this box converted to whatever units we would like, whether that's in oil in place, gas in place, water in place, reservoir volumes, etc. When you do RTA, we can, as we talked about before, we can use different methods. I would recommend when you use the different methods, use them for their strengths by themselves, in a sense. You can kind of compare them and stuff, but not mix and match too much, because the numerical RTA, a good example is like numerical RTA LFP would quantify for like all the flowing phases, right? Because it's a multi-phase problem that you solve. Like a classical RTA workflow that only uses oil would typically have a lower LFP because it only accounts for the oil flow. So, go ahead and do all the methodologies and whatnot, but when it comes to quantifying values, don't mix and match the values too much. That's my general recommendation. So now we're going to go through what we talked about a little bit more in detail on the theory part. And then the last hour, hopefully we can only use that to do exercises. So classical RTA, as we mentioned a few times, it assumes this one-dimensional model. This is from Steve Jones' paper. And again, the moving pieces in the square root of time plot, as we talked about, is material balance time, rate normalized pressure. It's the slope that we use to find the average K. And then we have time to end a linear flow. So I'm going to take all of these pieces right here, break them down, and actually show you the equations that's underlying here to make sure that you know when we were in this interface before the break, this interface right here, and you move these lines out, back and forth. How does that actually work in practice? And with this information, you should actually be able to even create this thing in Excel. And if you do that, just don't stop subscribing to Whitson Plus, I promise me. But anyways, the classical RTA workflow is only these 4 moving pieces right here. The first one is material balance time. And material balance time is, so that's basically what's on the x-axis right here, is actually the square root of material balance time. But it's really common to use that in rate transient analysis. And it is a superposition time function that converts variable rate data into an equivalent constant rate solution. It's rigorous for boundary dominated flows, it's kind of proven and whatnot, but it also works decently for infinite acting data as well. But it's only an approximation, so error is going to be up to 20% for linear flow. Okay. Mathematically, material balance time is expressed as follows. You take the cubes until a given day divided by the rates. So it's beautiful in the sense that it's really simple. Everybody can do it in Excel. And that's also why it has been really popularized. And it's also really accurate, actually, when you compare to at least synthetic cases where you're kind of honoring the fundamental assumptions that we're going through here. Okay, so very simple. A few problems we see with that is material balance time. If there's noisy rates, you can actually have kind of like your time doesn't actually progress in real time. Time can jump back and forward in time. That's something you would see a little bit. So that's one thing that people talk about. So many times, as we did before the break, they like to flip between material balance time and real time to try to do the diagnostics, at least in both time spaces, if you like. Why it is important to convert the variable rate data into an equivalent constant rate solution is something we're going to talk about later. And that's related to, it comes in the next few slides, so that's related to the equations that we use, the analytical equations we use. Second piece, okay, so again, we're just dealing with these 4 steps on the plot right here. So the second piece is rate normalized pressure. So after we got into the first, rate normalized pressure is very useful for production analysis, where we have both flowing pressures and rates that change through time. And it's just very easily defined as the flowing pressure drop divided by the rate. Okay, so this is what it is. The inverse of that is called pressure normalized rate. That's just exactly the same thing, just flipped on its head. That's it. Then you can see here that we actually show you both of these examples in the software. So we have pressure normalized rate here, and this is basically rate normalized pressure right there. So you have both of them in both of these modules, rate normalized pressure and pressure normalized rate. And we give you both because both are very, very fundamental. And again, we try to do that, or we use those properties because those properties account for both the changes in pressures and rates over time. Good. So some people call it RMPs or PNRs. So if you read like a lot of the Clarkson's in his book and stuff, you'll see like RMP and PNRs and stuff everywhere. Awesome. So that's the second thing. And then the third thing is related to the slope. Again, here when we get a slope, then we are using these equations right here to the right, depending on if it's an oil system or gas system. And you can see in the manual for all the other fluid systems how it's dealt with for water and stuff. This stuff right here is for gas something called pseudo pressure, and that's just because the compressibility of gas changes a lot over at these large pressure drops. So we try to account for that to linearize that equation. But except from that, it's actually, you can see it seems really kind of tricky, but actually if you look at the slope there, the slope is only PVT properties, and the slope is A root K. So it's the A root K and PVT properties that make the slope. So that is what the slope is. And both of these equations are derived assuming constant rate. So I don't know about you guys, but I remember back in school when I did a lot of the calculus classes and physics classes and some of these reservoir engineering classes and stuff, where you were going to kind of, you're going to prove the different equations. You're going to use different equations to come up with like kind of equations like this. Then we had to always assume these boundary conditions. And I remember in our class that when I went to school in California, we had a guy that every time the teacher asked a question, what could be the issue, or what's the problem with anything, or like his answer would always be it's the boundary conditions. And in this case, you have to, when you derive these equations for a given geometry, you have to pick these boundary conditions and assumptions. Basically, would you like the assumptions to be that you're producing at a constant rate, or would you like it to be that you're producing at the constant pressure? And what was surprising for me to learn when I started to learn about this 2-3 years ago is that if you assume constant rate versus assuming constant pressure, these equations right here, they'll differ with p halves. So that's 1.57. So for constant pressure, this equation right here will be around 30, and this will right here will be around 300. While for constant rate, it is what we see right here. So material balance time basically takes this variable rate and pressure data and converts it into a constant rate space, such that these equations, they apply rigorously, in situations where, you can assume single phase flow, etc. Okay, so that's why that's important. And again, in the manual, you can see that from, I remember that when I did Dave's classes and stuff as well. He, as I showed here earlier before lunch, or before the break, I think, when I went into this, like I showed Dave's equation here, right? And in his course, this is just a screenshot from his course. And then you see 31.3 is used. And 31.3 is just, p or pi halves multiplied with the 19 number. So that the only difference there, if you're ever confused about that, that is just a difference between constant rate and constant pressure solution. Okay, and everybody uses constant rate solution in all the softwares, because material balance time is used everywhere for these equations. In the software, you'll see that everything here is using constant rate. There's a bunch of things here. Okay, let's see here. So we use constant rate in the software as the solution here, and then at the bottom you actually see the constant pressure solutions, and the difference is only pi halves. Okay, so I spent enough time on that, but if you ever wonder about that, that's because of what I just told you. So the fourth thing, again, going back to the basics here, so back to this plot, the fourth thing that's moving is this time to end linear flow line. That time to end linear flow line is basically used to solve this equation to the right. So if I've assumed a well lateral length and a number of fractures, and I've assumed some PVT properties, and I've picked this time to end linear flow, you'll see that this equation right here only has one unknown, and that's K. Okay, that's one equation, one unknown. That's the kind of stuff that I remember still from school. And then you just plug that back into the equations that we just looked at, and we see what we're looking at right here. That is H and XF. That's the only unknowns we'll have in these equations right now, because we have PVT properties, we have K, and then we can solve for this parameter right here. And we plug that into the pore volume calculation, and then we just use PVT properties and water saturations and stuff to get to contacted pore volumes. Okay, so that's how all that stuff is linked together. So if you ever wondered about that, hopefully that's clear now. Any questions there, or was this probably okay? Maybe basics for some. I know I've run through it a few times with some of you guys at least, but anyways. Next thing right now is to run through numerical RTA. Like when we, in the software right here, we're just clicking a button. What is actually happening behind the scenes? How is this plot here even generated? And next time we're going to run through a well like this, hopefully that will be a little bit clearer when we do it. So the inputs to numerical RTA, as we talked about, are these inputs right here. And the underlying assumptions are the same as in analytical RTA. We assume a symmetry element model, a so-called one-dimensional model, with no flow beyond the frac tips or boundaries. And again, it's introduced to try to solve the inherent problems with kind of the industry standard workflows, which is the following. So when you're dealing with a well, you can create a simulation model. You can do this in Whitson Plus as well, really fast and simple. Say that you would like to plot this particular square root of time plot right here, constant bottom of pressure above the bubble point. And you know that you're in infinite acting linear flow, then this line on the square root of time plot should be linear. As long as you're in infinite acting linear flow or transient flow or like whatever we call it, infinite acting flow, this should give you a straight line, a perfect straight line. Deviation from this line should give you boundary dominant flow. Okay, so that's in an ideal scenario. And the plot captures that. The problem is if you start to introduce even just superposition effects, like sudden changes in BHP, for instance, as we are doing here to the left, and we overlay that on the same plot. Remember, this is an infinite acting model. It should only have one straight line over time. The problem then is that we start to get a bunch of different slopes. So the real slope should be the one in gray, and we're getting now a ton of these blue slopes. Okay, so we see that this is like which slope is correct. None of the slopes are actually the same as the gray one. So it is introducing some issues. And this is still this is single phase. We haven't even come to multi-phase flow yet. So if we take this a step forward, we go and drop the bottom wall pressure below the saturation pressure, like we're doing right here, for the same model, just at 2 different points in time, after 300 days and 140 days. This is on a square root of time basis. This is just bottom wall pressure versus time that we're looking at right here. Overlay the square root of time plot to this, you'll see that there's a slope change just as we go below the p-set, which is just an artifact of multi-phase flow and superposition effect. So this line should have been straight in like an ideal world, but it's not. That's what we're seeing in practice in the field. So when I showed you this is with real data. I showed you guys this earlier, so you can see this in this plot. Maybe a little bit tricky to see, but these are the saturated points. So this is actually below saturation pressure, and this is the undersaturated points, early time right here. So if I toggle those on, you can see that there's definitely a slope change after the time channel linear flow thing is reached right here. And just for an example here, a lot of people I know that looks at this data set, they would go in and pick time channel linear flow here, that give you 100 days. Well, in reality, when we're running our numerical RTA module, we see, you know, whatever this thing is at the top here when it starts to go down, which will be closer to 400 days. It's a huge difference in terms of interpretation for our data. Leads to in general is higher permeabilities, shorter fracture half lengths, and justifying more wells per section, which in many cases have led to overcapitalization. And that was actually where Apache came from when they introduced this workflow back in, you know, I don't know how many years ago now, but on the Midland side of the Permian Basin. So how to solve this is to use the so-called Bowie workflow that we, or numerical RTA workflow. It's nothing to do with any of these Bowies right here, but it's just from Braden at Apache and the paper that was presented. And for those that have read that paper, it's really, I like that paper because it basically presents 3 fundamental relationships that after you read the paper, you're like, okay, that makes sense. But before you read the paper, it's like you think after you read the paper that makes sense, but finding those relationships out in general is really tricky. So for any two wells where the LFP value is the same, then the rate performance is identical during infinite acting behavior. That's one of the key things in the paper. If the ratio of LFP to OIP is the same, then the GOR and water cut is identical for all times, both infinite acting and boundary dominated. And when the values of LFP and OIP is the same, then the rate performance is identical for all times, both infinite acting and boundary dominated. And these three relationships right here, like when you read a paper, that might not be some of the most important outcomes, but this is actually probably the essence of the paper and the workflow and why you can build the whole workflow in a nutshell. Note that these relationships are true for any two wells with the same fluid inertialization, so that's PVT and water saturations, relative permeability relationships over time, or relative permeability relationships, and bottom hole pressure variation versus time. So then you'd be like, okay, Matthias, but what two wells have all these things the same? Well, none. But we apply these relationships on one given well, and that's how we trick it into running this workflow for us, okay? So one given well has a PVT inertialization that's more representative, it has a rel perm set that's more representative, and it has a bottom hole pressure time variation that's more representative. To remind ourselves that these things are true, this is basically a plot indicating, okay, if we have the same LFP for three different cases, we see that during infinite acting flow, that we have the same infinite acting performance. And this is very, very easy to run in Whitson Plus, for instance. We see when it deviates, that's because of differences in contacted pore volume or tank size. If the LFP to OIP ratio is the same, the GOR is the same, actually the water cut is the same as well, and all the relative ratios is the same. And you can also see that the shape of the curves right here is the same, it's just a multiplier of each other. And the last thing, if the LFP and OIP is the same, then we get the same well performance for all times. So if we basically multiply up all of those cases to have the same LFP and contacted pore volume, the GOR for infinite acting and boundary dominated is the same, the cubes are the same, etc., etc. Everything is the same. And that is the key to the Bowie workflow. That is just an 8-step process that's happening behind the scene when you click run. So when you click this button right here, this is what it's happening in the background. So we take a large numerical model that's large enough to behave infinite acting for the entirety of historical time. Simple way to do that is just by trial and error. But you can create an arbitrary model with a large distance to its closest boundary where the LFP of the model is known. How do we know what the LFP of this model is? Well, I created it. I can create whatever model I want. I can put a fracture in it, I can put a perm in it, a height in it, an XF in it, and I can calculate the LFP of this model. And I just make sure that there's in the lifetime that I'm running the model, not possible to reach a reservoir boundary. That's easy. I take this model where I have essentially enforced upon a flow regime that's infinite acting upon the data, and I control it on the bottom of pressure. And that's what you'll see in the software, that if the model is able to if the tank size is big enough, then it will basically honor the bottom of pressure. So that's why the bottom of pressure is spot on. And you'll see the difference is basically the average reservoir pressure over time for the tank sizes. So that's correlated to how big the tank is. Once you've done that, when you run the infinite acting model and the well's actual measured bottom of pressure, you get a set of rates versus time, and those rates are infinite acting model rates. So they have enforced upon this flow regime that's infinite acting. Then you take the actual, that's step number 3, the actual model rates in the field, and you divide that by the what you have in the model, and you get a ratio over time. That ratio is telling you how many of these models do I need every single day to make that up that production. That ratio over time, if you multiply that with the LFP that you arbitrarily decided in step 1, you get the diagnostic plot, which is this Bowie plot. And in that Bowie plot, a flat horizontal line indicates the infinite acting linear flow. Deviation below this line represents boundary dominated or transitional flow, and the magnitude of the flat line itself indicates the LFP. Okay, so that's how you get the LFP out. In step number 3, you can use the rates to calculate this ratio, or you can use the cums. So when I say that there's a difference between cumulative LFP or instantaneous LFP, that is the difference. Why do we have, I'm a cum guy personally. Why do we use cums in general with noisy data? It looks smoother. That's the honest truth. It's like, that's why you use the pressure integral sometimes in the child pressure group methodology. That's some people use rate integrals and stuff. That's just smooth out the data. And that's basically the same. It's kind of like using an integral. So once you have this diagnostic plot over time, you just rerun the steps that you've done in 1 and 2 for the smaller tank sizes. What will happen is that you will get these different type curves that goes into boundary sooner and sooner. So that's what the software is doing right here. This is about sooner and sooner, and you see this went into boundary dominated flow very early. Then this guy, this guy, this guy, and this guy. Yeah, and then you pick a LFP, you overlay the type curves, and you try to find the contacted pore volume that's closest to your type curve. Or like we did in the example, we pick something in between. That can be a really good pick as well. So just to summarize, flat horizontal line, infinite acting linear flow. Deviation below this line is boundary dominated or transitional flow, and the magnitude of the flat line indicates the LFP. And then these different type curves, that's basically just type curves run still on the same bottom of pressure, still the same PVT, etc., honoring the full multiphase FMB, etc. It just gives you different tank sizes. And what have you done? You have done RTA. You picked an LFP and you picked a contacted pore volume. So to look at a little bit bigger lens, what you need as step 1 is PVT and rel param. Step 2, do your interpretations. And if you want to, you can use that to resolve parameters. So just if you want to, you click export here and start to resolve parameters. And then you can run a history matched simulation model. That history matched simulation model you can use for drawdown management, forecasting, etc., etc. So yeah, and again, this is exactly the same stuff we've always done. LFP is the slope, contacted pore volume is time to NL linear flow. So on the fractional RTA side, a little bit more in detail there. Again, we've talked about the problem that has been addressed, that we're trying to account for more complex fractures. That's okay. We've already talked about the difference in terms of what you're trying to resolve. Basically, getting a fractional RTA gives you AK to the delta. And that's what we call this, call it modified or generalized LFP parameter. It's just a little bit more flexible, if you like, and it tries to account for all this complexity. Again, how we get the delta parameter is from the rate normalized pressure plot. You could also get it from the inverse exercise. So when I say the rate normalized pressure plot is this exercise that we're doing right here. You can also do it from the inverse exercise, which is from this guy right here. It doesn't really matter. And the physical significance of delta is what is summarized here. Note on this plot, if I know some of you guys are writing, let's see that in some of the text and stuff that you guys are writing some notes yourself. If there's one note that you should mention here, when it comes to the physical significance of delta, there's a little footnote here, which is called material balance time. And a really important thing there is that these ranges are true for material balance time. And the reason why we like to do this in material balance time is because for real time, it doesn't make sense. Because in real time, the delta would be 0.5 and boundary dominated flow would be minus infinity. And transitional flow will be anything in between. So it's really hard to communicate. Like, my delta was minus 100,000. What does that even mean? And it's going back to the fact that for those of you who've done a lot of this work in the past, like doing ARPs in material balance time, then the boundary dominated flow in material balance time gives you a B factor of 1, while in real time it gives you a B factor of 0. Okay, which is exponential exponential decline. Okay, so that's going back to the same thing. So just note that we do this in material balance time. So in this feature right here in fractional RTA, we do that in material balance time. But if you want to, and that's another thing I didn't touch upon, that there's a direct relationship between delta and the ARP speed parameter. So if you would like to do that with have a physics-based anchoring of that B parameter, you actually need to do that in real time because you know, something like this for this well. And then you get that ARPS parameter in real time because, of course, ARPS is only in real time. So when it comes to the equations here, on the oil side, the equation is for the slope in this m right here. It's given to the right there, and for gas, it is the equation on the lower side there. And yeah, I know what you guys are thinking, because I was thinking the exact same thing. That this is a crazy advanced equation. You know, gamma distributions and stuff. That's I'm not smart enough to even think about those kind of distributions. But if you think about it, and if you do the math, it's actually very familiar stuff. So we start with the oil equation right here, the oil slope. And if we put in a delta of 0.5, we get 19.927. And you have seen this equation before. It is a classic, and it's actually the same equation that we looked at before, right? So then it simplifies to this equation right here. And that's the solution for linear flow for a constant rate when we assume evenly spaced fractures. Okay. If for gas, if you do the same thing, this becomes 208, and this per delta of 0.5, and we've seen this before as well. So it's just a more complicated version of the same equation, basically. A challenge to the audience would be to try to correlate the delta parameter to completion practices. I've seen some of you guys have done that successfully in general. One thing, an idea that was thrown around was, you know, a delta of 0.5 could mean high cluster efficiency, or if it, at least if it goes from 0.5 to 0, and then if it's far from 0.5, maybe poor cluster efficiency, or if you see a wide range of deltas over time. Something to think about. Second to last thing, before we're going to do a short break and then exercises for the rest of the day in the software, is related to the kind of the combination of fractional and numerical RTA. Little disclaimer there, there's nothing we have in the software right now. We're working on it. We presented a couple of papers on it last year. It's not as trivial to just do in a generic fashion, but I'll go through the main issues. So if you did, if you did both analytical RTA or numerical RTA, where your true flow regime was actually transitional flow, what will happen with, or the limitations of classical numerical RTA, is what you're seeing right here. You basically will have a type curve that crosses through a wide range of stems, and you see that with the oil rate plot here. The black line is the actual production data, and all your stems, it basically just crosses through all the stems, and it doesn't have the same slope either as the rest of the stems. And that's because classical numerical RTA doesn't account for a delta that's not equal to 0.5. So a way to merge or marry numerical RTA and fractional RTA was something we, Curtis and I, and I think Braden was on one of the papers as well, something we presented last year, where the only differences to the workflow is that we just defined LFP like this. The contacted pore volume is still the same. The fundamental relationships are still very, very similar, but the key thing there is that as long as your LFP, contacted pore volume, and delta parameter are the same, then the rate performance is identical for all times. That means that you'll have the same production during infinite acting flow, transitional flow, and boundary dominated flow. It's beautiful in that sense. And an example showing that, this is 3 different cases. As long as the delta is the same, the contacted pore volume is the same, etc., then all the curves are overlapping perfectly. So that's why you don't see different cases, because they're a perfect overlap of each other. And when it comes to kind of the key point here, I'm trying to educate, is like, okay, the beautiful thing, or one of the beautiful things that Acuna kind of provided, was this recipe of how you can create a delta distribution, let's say a delta of 0.3, Okay, if your delta is 0.3, he could say, okay, then you need this distribution of fractures or symmetry of element models, and you need this many of this size, this many of this size, this many of this size, and this many of this size. So obviously here, for this model, this will go to boundaries soonest, and then this, and then this, this, and this. This will be infinite acting for the longest period of time. And of course, the delta of each individual symmetry of element model is 0.5. But when you add them together like this, you'll see like for these 4 different cases, there'll be initially a delta of 0.5. They'll go into boundary dominated flow sooner and sooner. And then the cumulative response of it, if you add them together, is something that is not a delta of 0.5, and it looks like this power law relationship. And you can include this in your numerical RTA workflow to account for where the inputs are essentially PVT, production data, delta, and the rel perm. And you can actually change the rel perm, deltas and whatnot as well, and kind of iterate on a delta that does better versus worse. So we're working on getting that into the software. It's actually just going to be one additional input parameter in the workflow. So we're excited about getting that in there. The last piece is numerical simulation modeling. So that's basically step 5 here. So after we're done with the numerical RTA, going into simulation and forecasting, we're basically creating a numerical realization. So right here, when I go in, again, the stuff at the top here, all this stuff is inputs, and all the stuff, all the stuff at the bottom here is inputs, and all the other stuff here is essentially outputs. So when I change, for instance, the number of fractures here to 100 from 300, you see it changes my other parameters here, but my content to pore volume and LFP is the same. So my history match, when I do that in my numerical model, is the same. But this is just one realization to get that history match and potentially forecast. Okay, so what I'm stressing here is that your numerical RTA interpretation is quote unquote unique, but for that unique interpretation, the number of realizations that you can make going from the numerical RTA to the realization is infinite. Okay, so these are just the 3 different examples, but for any of no matter how we combine these results together, the history match is the same, and if the abandonment pressure for the different cases are the same, then that will also be give you the same EOR. Okay, and that should be the same in any numerical engine, whether that is Eclipse, SimGeomics, T-Navigator, Sensor, or OPM Flow. And again, this full physics, there's no hybrid model or anything here, full physics model that you can export into any of these different tools. When it comes to the gridding, you can, at the top here in the numerical model or the numerical RTA module, anything where you run numerical models, you can change between very low, low, medium, and high grid refinement. The gridding is a mix of logarithmic and uniform gridding. And in short, more grids gives you a more numerically accurate result, but it takes more time to run. So in practice, you're dealing with this kind of interface or this nice balance between accurate results and practicability. That's what you're dealing with. Also, a oil or like a well control. We didn't play much with that earlier, but we're going to do that together now. But in general, what you're saying to the software is, if I pick gas, then I'm going to match my gas rate perfectly. So that's what you see here, that my gas rate is perfectly matched. That's an input to the simulation model that we control the model on. And then I try to match everything else in the model. And then you can do that in the software on water, liquid, BHP, oil in general. And there's also a BHP synthetic, which is just more for synthetic cases. Yeah, and these are just some examples of it. One thing to note, if you have really noisy bottom pressure, that will lead to noisy rates. So that's something just to think about. Last thing here is just to emphasize that there's 2 kinds of forecasters, those who don't know and those who don't know they don't know. And what I mean by that is when you're doing a forecast, you're making an assumption about how the bottom pressure is going to look like in the future. And with 100% certainty, even though you have everything in the model 100% spot on correct, we can't say, if there's any frac hits or if there's any downtime or if there's a freeze. So like up in Canada was like a fire and like all kinds of things there that can come in and change our bottom hole or price environments that forces us to shut it in as well, etc. So here I think just consistency in the forecast, abandonment pressure, etc. is the most important. And with that, we're going to take a. I think we're going to take a. No, actually, we're going to run through a example first together in the software, and then we're going to take a break. Okay, any questions before we're going to do that? Now everybody has a little bit more meat on the bones, and we have a lot of content to cover. Some of it is kind of sit back and relax stuff, and some of it is not. So if everybody can go over to their wells right now, and in the wells we're going to do the pheasant well. Again, just real quick on. And before doing that, I'd like everybody to so hopefully everybody is in this view right now with the wells in the software. Can everybody just give a thumbs up if they're there? Something like this. Okay, wow, there's a lot of thumbs up, perfect. Let's go to the pheasant well, and let's go to PVT. And we'll not spend a lot of time on PVT, but we would like to be at the pheasant well right there at the top. And then in the reservoir fluid composition card, since this is a dry gas well, has no GOR, we're going to go from the method being GOR to dry gas. And then we're going to make the specific gravity 0.6. Okay. What the software does on the PVT side is exactly the same thing. It predicts the fluid composition, it creates the PVT tables, but now since it's a dry gas well, it's much more simple. One thing at this point that I'd like to show you guys is is under wells again. If you go back to where everybody gave me the thumbs up, in edit all up to the right here, that's where you can edit all the data for your wells, just like kind of from Excel like this. And here, the matrix gamma and fracture gamma, let's just make those parameters 2. And then once you've made them 2, just click save. Okay, so just make sure that your matrix gamma and fracture gamma are set to 2 up here to the right. Okay, once that's done, we're going to go down to production data. And in production data, I'm just going to show you guys a couple of things, primarily the edit functionality, just to see how to delete data. So in production data, up to the right, there's an edit icon. And if you want to delete data, it's exactly like in Excel. This is basically an Excel sheet on the web. You can plus things together, etc. But just go all the way to the bottom of it. Let's just take some of the data out and just click delete. And once you click delete, it doesn't matter how much data, a few lines, just click save. Delete on your keyboard and click save. So that's how you delete data. In this interface as well, I'll just show you guys this real quick. You don't have to do it, but I'll just show you. There's also a smooth functionality up to the right here. That smooth functionality has a few nice things. So let's say for this one that I would like to take the gas rate, and from here and out, I would like to just ignore everything that's after that, and I would like to use a constant rate after. Of course, for this is not true, but let's just say that that's the case. And I click save. What happens now is that you see that my gas rate has changed to this flat line right here. So the smoothing option is basically a way for you to say, would I like to use a smoothed version of the production data, which can be, or like an edited version of it. That's really powerful for when you have bad data, or would you like to use the raw data? And to now I changed it back so it shows the same thing. Very good. Okay, so with the PVT and production data, we're not going to do anything with the bottom of pressure. We're going to go straight to analytical RTA. And in analytical RTA, you should see that, yeah, you should see that it's automatically picked to the gas phase because it's a gas well. You can click auto fit. Here you have an LFP, and you have a contacted pore volume in general here, and it looks like it's in infinite acting linear flow for a long time. And then late time here might look like we're dealing with some boundary effects. A little bit hard to see. You could also flip this into real time if you think the data is smooth enough. And here you see some of the problems is probably amplified here. So what is happening is that we go from constant rate, and then we open up the well, and we're starting to flow, and essentially the LFP line here is changing as we do that. Okay, and that's just an artifact of changing pressures really fast. Okie doke. The second thing I'd like you to do is just go to fractional RTA. Again, here we see delta is around 0.5, and late time delta is around 0. Yeah, 0.5 to 0, like that. So that's also another way of looking at it for this particular well. And I'll give everybody just if they want to look at a few things there, just a couple of okay, so we all think, at least I think, that this is an infinite acting, or this is in boundary dominant flow at the end of history. So now we're going to go down to numerical model, and this is actually where I would like to spend a little bit of time. You just go in, you click run. We're not going to worry about water for now, but I would like us to look at a few of these, like how these things are actually connected. So going back to what we talked about in the course, LFP, rate, etc. So once the plot is generated, it should look something like this. You only click a run up to the left. This is with 5 different default stems, like this. Okie doke. So what I'm going to show you guys now is if I put this into this rate space like this, and let's ignore water for now. We control it on bottom of pressure, so that's great. If I move this line right here down, you see that all my simulated curves, their IPs go down. And what is changing? That's my LFP up here. So LFP and IP is correlated. Okay, so that's back to Sam's slide there earlier. The quadrant or whatever we call it is this guy right here. That's basically what we're talking about here. If I move this down, our rate go down. And I can also do this in instantaneous LFP, by the way, which is if I click this button right here. Okay. The second thing is that you see what is the difference between these different stems. If I've picked an LFP now, the LFP of all of these models are the same, but their cumes are changing. And the difference between these cumes, the only difference between them are the size of the tank. And the largest one is the one that we see matches the data the best in this case. So once you've laid this on top of your data, this will probably give you a contacted pore volume that's closer to 26 BCF. Once you're happy with that, you can go in here, click export, and you can click yes. And once you've done that, you can just go ahead and click click, actually in here, when you click export, again, in a numerical RTA, when you click yes here, into numerical model, just change it to bottom of pressure. And in on the well control here on bottom of pressure, just go ahead and click run. Change it to bottom of pressure right here. So now you see we have a perfect fit on our bottom of pressure, and we have a pretty decent fit on our gas. You know, we saw we didn't do a 100% perfect fit, so I'll do a little, show you guys a little trick to make sure that we get to that point. Okie doke. Let's ignore water again. So who has come here? People kind of gotten here. Can you give a reaction or something? Yeah. If good. Okay, so we've gotten there. Everybody has an ish of a match. That's great. And if they have not gotten there, just send an email to support. So what we're going to do now, because we can change all these things manually, right? We can change it a little bit. Same goes here. Same goes here. We're going to go into sensitivities now, which is this guy right here. And in sensitivities, under reservoir properties sensitivity, we're going to open that, and we're going to pick matrix perm. Okay. And in matrix perm, we're going to click save. And once we've clicked save, we're going to click modified cases here. So that's a way for us to bulk run different cases with different perm. And you see that in our model, I see that behind here, our model is 31 non RC. So I'm going to pick some ranges around there, 30, 35, 40, 45, for instance. And then once I've defined those, I'm going to click run. And I'm going to show this one more time. So when you're in history matching, you can go to sensitivities. And these bulk runs are fast. Like we run 5 different cases now, like that. And now we can pick which case that's kind of the closest. Looks like case 3 or something here. Okay. So again, you need to be in sensitivities here at the top. In sensitivity, pick matrix permeability. And when we pick matrix permeability, you modify the cases and add the cases here. You can pick many or several of them, and that's a way for you to do this. Okay, and I'll also show you how to. There's a different well control or different sensitivity type called well control, and I'll show you guys that a little bit later. Awesome. There is a very similar functionality for probabilistic here, probabilistics. I'll just show that real quick, really similar, and then we'll take a break, and I'll run it for matrix permeability and factor half length. Then just make them both normal distributions, and I'll go ahead and click run, and then you can. But it's very similar to what you did in sensitivities. So hopefully everybody was able to do the sensitivities piece. Yeah, there's no oil rates, so that's kind of boring at the top there. And here we see the sensitivity run for this case. Okie doke. So with that, we're going to take a 10-minute break. We'll be back at 11:20. If anybody has some issues with any of this, feel free to just write me an email in the meanwhile, and I'll help you in the break here, and we take it from there. Oh. Okay. So we'll get over to kind of the last part of the course, and that's a little bit more of a show and tell, I think, in general. So we'll do that off pist a little bit, unless there's any questions. Okay, I think we're good at that. So in the projects that you have in the wells, let's go ahead and make a synthetic well here under add well up to the right. So just make sure that you're in the project here and add well. And we're going to call that TS or whatever your name is. Click save. And then under reservoir fluid composition right here, go in and put in 1000. Click save. I'm just going to show you how to create like a synthetic well. So now we have basically gotten our PVT. And again, if you didn't get the first step here, go to your well overview, click add well up to the right. Under that well, just call it your name or whatever. Call it Matthias. And then you can go to the numerical model. And then we just go ahead and click, we can just go ahead and click run like this. And what we did now is that we're basically running a synthetic model on the synthetic BHP control. What that synthetic BHP control does is that it says, I would like to control the model on from the initial reservoir pressure to a minimum bottom pressure of 1000, and I would like that to happen over 450 days, and from there and out I would like it to be constant. And again here, this is the profile that the software is then generating like this. If I go all the way up to the right now in export, I can go and say, okay, I would like to set this historical data equal to the simulated data. And what the software goes ahead and does that is that it overwrites the, or basically assumes that the production data is the simulated data. So I can then go in and run my like analytical RTA and my numerical RTA and check that all the results make sense, etc. What I wanted to do in this exercise for you guys is two things. The first thing is to show you guys how to create a synthetic model like this, how to upload that data, because it's used a lot here. And then I'll show you a last thing, which is relationship to well control. Yeah. Okay. So one last thing now before I would like us to. Okay, let's go ahead and do this. Go back to PVT in the PVT feature right here. Make it 10,000 instead of 1,000. That will just make it a gas condensate. Very simple. Well, how do we know that? Well, we see that here. And the gas condensate we can go down to our numerical model. We just run that model one more time. Now you can see also how fast it is to run these models for like simple inputs, if you like. And we just do the same exercise again. Once the results have come up here, we just click export up to the right, and we say set historical data equal to simulated data. Okay. Once we're happy with that, we go to sensitivities here at the top. And people need to write in the chat if this goes too fast. In the sensitivities here at the top, instead of running reservoir property sensitivity, we want to change it to well control. Right here. You're going to add in 3 different cases. And I'm going to make one that's really aggressive. 50 days, 100 days, and 200 days. Like this. And what the difference is how fast I'm drawing down the well right here. And then I'm going to go in and click save. And then if it doesn't update like this, just click refresh one time like we talked about before. And then once you're happy with it, you can just go ahead and click run. And now we're running all of these 3 models in parallel, and they're already done. The reason why I'm showing you guys this is that you can use this to, for instance, look at drawdown management differences. So for this well right here, you can see that because by drawing this well down really aggressively, I'm making less condensate than if I had a more conservative drawdown scenario or the drawdown profile, if that makes sense. So that's what you see. That's what you see here between these 3 different cases. So it's a really nice, quick way to do some analysis on differences in drawdown strategy. Okay, so that was the 2 things I wanted to show with the synthetic case. There is one last well in your project there called Crow. I don't want us to do the full workflow on that just because of time, but I would like you to go in here and just fast go in and run the PVT. And make sure that this Crow well is on the PVT. And then you can go from the PVT part just down into analytical RTA and just click AutoFit or something like that. But this plot right here, I would like us to overlay that on the same plot in the diagnostic plot. And that goes down all the way down here in the diagnostic plot to the left. And this is where you can create templates, etc., for different types of diagnostic plots and whatnot. So I can go ahead and take these 2 different analyses right here, and I can say, okay, I would like to plot the square root of time plot for oil for these 2 wells, maybe even the last well that I created right here, and plot them on the same plot. And then I can see this productivity, or which are the productivities that are basically, or which are the wells that has the highest productivity. I can hide the legend at the top here by clicking hide legend. And now I'm just using an already database template here to the left as well. And I can change the colors to spread the colors like this, if I'd like to. And also if I click Control one of these lines, it opens up this menu right here. So I can say, okay, I don't want to have any lines here, so no lines. You can set the color of them individually, etc. Okie doke. So this was really productive. Anyways. Very good. So that was the one thing. All the rest of the stuff now, I'm just going to show you guys real quick because of time, so you can just sit back and relax. The first one is related to auto RTA, so you can go into wells. And you can toggle all of these different wells right here. And in the run option right here, there's a bunch of different bulk run functionalities. So you can run the PVT on them, the BHP, the flow material balance, the autofits, etc. So you can go in here and run, okay, I would like to run the autofit for all of these wells. And what happens in the background now is that if I go into like the kite well on the analytical RTA, that the primary fluid autofit is done on this fluid. Okay, so that's a way for you to go in and do this for these wells. Okie doke. So that's a autofit functionality right there that you can launch in bulk mode, and that's the key part here, is that there's a bunch of functionality that you can launch in bulk mode, and there's also more coming now in the next release. One topic that we get asked very often is related to basically, I guess, justification of introducing a fracture conductivity that is lower than 100. If it's like 1,000, it's typically infinite conductive fractures. Mathematically, what it means is that there's just a pressure drop between the matrix and the wellbore. So a few things that can indicate that this number has to be lower is, for instance, a positive intercept on the square root of time plot. So this plot right here, for instance, if this plot has a positive intercept, maybe you can see a little bit of that here on the kite wall, like this. If it runs through 0, you'll see that the fracture connectivity is really high and probably infinite at the true 0 right there. And if it goes, the further up it goes, you'll see that the fracture connectivity becomes lower and lower, like this. So that's one indication of low fracture connectivity. The second thing, and that comes from Steve Jones' papers, is that once you go below the saturation pressure, if your GORs doesn't shoot up, like shoot up when it goes below the saturation pressure, this well basically has not that type of behavior. Here you see it goes below saturation pressure, and it just, boom, shoots up immediately as gas comes out of solution. But if it linearly increases like this is kind of like an indication that, yeah, there's some pressure drop between the matrix and the wellbore. Other indications might be increasing LFPs on the Bowie diagnostic plot. It can also be that you're not matching the actual buildups in the field with your models. And you can also look at the different slopes on the PNR plot. So if it's something that's shallower than a half slope on RMP plot, it might indicate that you have either cleanup or it can be low fracture connectivity. Okay, so that's this plot right here. So here all this stuff is below. This is probably just due to cleanup, but if it was a really clear signature right there, like this, it might indicate that you were dealing with low fracture connectivity. Similarly, on pressure-dependent permeability, that's a topic that's really, I guess, kind of debated and stuff in the industry. When to include it, how to include it, why including it, and that's basically these parameters right here. So a pressure-dependent permeability, that the permeability changes as you go, as your pressure draws down. There's a few different ways of indicating that from just well performance. So if you have a Bowie diagnostic plot that crosses through a wide range of different stems, and you can't kind of find one good stem that fits the data, that might be one of them. The other one is the same as with FCD, that the actual pressure buildup isn't able to model the buildup you're seeing in the field. If you see a parallel type of well performance, if your delta is not 0.5 or 0, but something in between, that is a way to model that type of behavior. And also if you see kind of suppressed GOR behavior as you go below saturation pressure. So some of the same or similar type of indications as for low fracture connectivity, but they'll have some clear differences there, especially early time. Yeah, we've talked about doing analytical RTA, but I'll show that just once again. If you want to reduce noise, you can include a total reservoir fluid. So that just means that you include more of the phases in when you do the diagnostic plots. In the numerical model of the software, we have multi-layer options. So if you would like to include multi-layers, you can do that really simply by adding the number of layers here up to the right. And if you have the multi-layer option here activated, you can go in here and say, okay, I would like to switch to the multi-layer module. And then in the fluid, you can make different fluid saturations and GORs in the different layers. So you can have essentially different PVT. You can say have one super low GOR layer, and you can have a very high GOR layer, and their respective water saturations, for instance, like this. And you can change them to be different. And you can change this as much as you like, how many layers as you like. The last thing I want to show, just as a part of the course today, is related to a few things that's coming now in the next release, but it's related to derivative analysis. See here. So derivative analysis is something that's been used a lot in well testing in general, and has recently also shown kind of use for it in ray transient analysis as well. So that's in analytical RTA right here. So if I went in and did the same thing in this domain right here. Let's say I just pick a quick well here, create a synthetic case. And let's say I just make a GOR like this. Let's say I pick a simple case above saturation pressure. I can make like a single phase flow case maybe. Say no water, and then just constant bottom of pressure above saturation pressure. Let's run that case for the scenario. So we'll look a little bit different here if things are plugged. Yeah. So now we only have two phases, and if I went into analytical RTA, you'll see that there's a different option here in the plot, and maybe it's easier to show it in fractional here. So I can include derivatives here at the top. Basically plotting these derivatives, and then you see you get this additional line right here, which should basically the same half slopes and everything should apply. It's only that you see the changes faster with derivatives. So I think Dave Anderson puts it beautifully. Derivative analysis amplifies the signal, but it also amplifies the noise. So here you can see if I add a half slope to this well right here, is really clear half slope, and then here when I go into a unit slope late time, you'll see that much earlier and clearer when you do this with derivative analysis versus the pressure normalized rate analysis, if that makes sense. But the unit slopes and everything, so you still use that for flow regime identification. And what happens when you add that PNR plot, when you basically turn it on like this, you see what happens down to the left. It's that you get some options of derivative analysis if you want to use the Bourdais derivative, weighted central difference, etc. So you can decide on which of those that you like to use. And with this synthetic data, it doesn't really come out clearly why it's important. But if you went in and picked if you took a well with some actual real data here, maybe I could take let me just add a quick example here. And then I'll just mass upload. Where do we have that again? It's there. Something like this. So let's take that, and I have to show it on this domain just because it's not pushed to you guys yet. But yeah. So here you see when we add the derivatives there. Yeah. So here you see what happens when we have the real data with noise in it. That it can be really important to smooth the noise out, but else it can be really, really noisy. And the problem is if you just use regular derivatives and not these Bourdais derivatives, it's just like, okay, it's just a cluster, so you can't really use it for much. So that's when these derivative functions and options there can be useful. Except from that, there's not really much else that I wanted to go through today. I think we emphasized the most important things. We were able to go through a few wells. For me, the most important thing in terms of numerical RTA is just that you make sure that you have kind of initialized your model correctly with both that you're matching the water cuts and the GORs decently before you start to interpret the plot. That's a really big one. and that you can use these different types of diagnostic plots for some general diagnostic trends, etc. We've tried to kind of cover all the different buckets as well in the course that we introduced earlier. So everybody has been able to do some simple flow regime identification. Everybody has been able to, which is these guys right here. Everybody's been able to create these diagnostic plots where you overlay all that data. They can quantify both the LFP and the contented pore volume such that you can loop that into a numerical model to get a history match and resolve physical parameters. But here, just remember to be a little bit careful, or at least make sure that you're comfortable with these assumptions before you take or you use it for well spacing decisions and these things. So with that, if there's is there any questions at this point? Clear as mud, as I say. Okay, so perfect. What we'll do is that we'll go ahead and stop the recording here. If there's any questions, whenever, feel free to reach out to support@whitson.com. We'll send out a little follow-up email after this course as well. Yeah, we're always available. If you want to take some of your own wells for a spin, and you would like to have like a little brainstorming session and stuff as well, we do that literally every single day, several times a day. So just feel free to do that, and we can brainstorm on what we're seeing, how to kind of do the workflow successfully, etc. There's always some corner cases and stuff that's out there. Appreciate it.